Welcome. My name is John Park. I'm the director of the Korea Project at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. Today, we'll be doing a deep dive on day 2 of the second Harvard Korean Security Summit. Yesterday in day 1, we looked at the non-traditional security issues playing out on the Korean Peninsula, with a specific focus on North Korea's growth of its cyber capabilities, as well as an examination of the COVID-19 lessons from the peninsula. Today in day 2, we'll be examining the traditional security issues with a key focus on North Korea and its young leader, Kim Jong-un. Our first panel today is the beginning of a new tradition at the summit. We'll be placing the spotlight on the authors of new books about North Korea and its young leader. Robin Wright will be the moderator, and she'll also be introducing our speakers. Robin is an award-winning journalist who's also a U.S. Institute of Peace Wilson Center Distinguished Fellow. She's a longtime writer for The New Yorker, a former diplomatic correspondent for The Washington Post, and has reported from over 140 countries. The American Academy of Diplomacy selected Robin as a Journalist of the Year for distinguished reporting and analysis of international affairs. She also won the National Press Club Award for diplomatic reporting and has been a recipient of a MacArthur Foundation grant. Robin has written or edited 8 books, including the widely acclaimed ROK the Kasbah, Rage and Rebellion Across the Islamic World. She's also written widely on North Korea. It's great to have you with us today, Robin. Over to you.
Thank you, John. I am honored to be moderating this panel today with 3 exceptional experts, each with their own extraordinary credentials to discuss the world's most mercurial leader. I've been fascinated with the Kim Dynasty since I first traveled to North Korea with Madeleine Albright 2 decades ago, and more recently went back to cover the Trump-Kim diplomacy. I really look forward to hearing the stories and analysis of our 3 very distinguished authors today. Anna Fifield is the former Beijing bureau chief for the Washington Post. She's covered all aspects of Greater China. She was also the Post's bureau chief in Tokyo between 2014 and 2018, where she focused on Japan and the Koreas, but periodically reported from the other parts of Asia. She particularly concentrated on North Korea, trying to shed light on the lives of ordinary people there and on how the regime managed to stay in power all these decades. She is the author of the widely acclaimed The Great Successor, The Divinely Perfect Destiny of Brilliant Comrade Kim Jong-un. She started as a journalist from her home country in New Zealand and then worked for the Financial Times for several years. I'm delighted to have her join us. Our second author is Dr. Van Jackson, who is an adjunct senior fellow at the Asia Pacific Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. He's an American political scientist and one of the world's foremost experts on Korean security. He's a professor of international relations at Victoria University of Wellington and the Defense and Strategy Fellow at the Center for Strategic Studies in New Zealand. He is the author of 2 Cambridge University Press books on U.S.-North Korea relations. The first is On the Brink, Trump, Kim, and the Threat of a Nuclear War. And the second is Rival Reputations, Coercion and Credibility in U.S.-North Korea Relations. Our third author is the Stanton Senior Fellow in Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He is an expert on the Asia Pacific region, and his research interests range from nuclear strategy to arms control, missile defense, non-proliferation, emerging technologies, and U.S. extended deterrence. He is the author of Kim Jong-un and the Bomb, Survival and Deterrence in North Korea. He was previously a senior fellow in Defense Posture Project at the Federation of American Scientists. And he's the editor at large of The Diplomat. So let me begin with just a basic question to each of you. What motivated you to write this book, and what did you learn in the process of writing it? Let me begin with Anna.
Thank you very much, Robin, for the introduction. And kia ora, as we say from New Zealand. We have 100% of New Zealand's North Korea watching community on this call right now. And it's so nice as well to see so many familiar names in the attendee list. So hi, everybody. The genesis of my book basically came from my own kind of fascination with how Kim Jong-un had managed to defy all of the expectations and predictions and remain in power. So I traveled to North Korea a bunch of times between 2005 and 2008 during the Kim Jong-il era, and the whole country, you know, it seemed very broken, and there was clearly no love at all for Kim Jong-il. And I just didn't see how this regime, this anachronistic regime, would be able to survive another transition to a third generation Kim. So when I returned in 2014 for the Washington Post, I was really shocked to see not just that the country was, well, Kim Jong-un had managed to hold the country together, but it actually seemed to be doing relatively well. The economy had improved a little bit, and the facade on the Potemkin village became a little more shinier, I guess. It got a paint job. So I, as a reporter, went out and tried to just report out how Kim Jong-un had managed to do this, what his upbringing had been like, what kind of training he'd had for the job, how he, at 27 years old, with no experience or qualifications, had been able to do this extremely difficult thing of holding together a regime that should have collapsed, you know, several decades earlier. So that's what I set out to do. At the end of my reporting, you know, there are still many questions that I'm not able to answer yet, but it was my best shot at this time of writing a kind of quasi-biography of Kim Jong-un.
So Van, let's turn to you. What motivated you to write the book, and what'd you learn in the process?
Yeah, so I didn't set out to write this book initially. In 2016, I could see reasons why Korea was kind of this slow-moving disaster waiting to happen. The conditions for crisis were all there, but the policy choices and the policy conversation around North Korea stuff was very kind of like conservative and risk averse, and there wasn't a lot of room to kind of influence the conversation. So I didn't even think there was a book to be had here initially. But then Trump came to office. He starts talking about having a hamburger with the guy. And then Kim Jong-un assassinates his older half brother with a chemical weapon in an airport. And suddenly you've got maximum pressure as the new strategic patient. And I knew from previous research that I did on North Korea that like there's this pattern that was only recently come to the fore, that we've recently acknowledged, whereby North Korea responds almost reflexively to pressure with pressure in kind. And so I knew, I had alarm bells immediately that like, okay, maximum pressure is going to translate into maximum defiance, maximum backlash. And that is precisely what happened. There wouldn't have been a crisis if it wasn't for the mirror imaging going on of like maximum pressure versus maximum pressure, basically. And so that is where I found myself in like mid 2017. And I was talking to friends who were in the administration who transitioned from Obama to Trump. A number of them were civil servants, so it was not a political thing necessarily, but they were communicating, you know, that like the White House, some parts of the NSC and Pacific Command were in like a very different headspace about North Korea. We were basically ready for war. This is not the North Korea policy of old. Like the old American playbook is out the window. And that got me doubly nervous because these are normally, you know, people who are, they're, for one thing, they're Korea experts, but they're also like cool customers, like not alarmists. So looking at all of that, I was doing media stuff along with Ankit and Anna and a bunch of other people. But the 30-second sound bites wasn't enough to do justice to the dangers that I saw. 1,000-word op-eds weren't enough either. It deserved a book level treatment. So that was kind of what I did. And then I just had this fortuitous thing with my publisher from my last book. And that's kind of how it came together.
Fascinating. So Ankit, tell us the story of what motivated you to write the book and what you learned in the process.
Sure. Thanks, Robin, for that introduction, first of all, and John and Co for having me here today. It's great to be on a panel with Anna and Van. My book was the last to be published in the series, and I must say I benefited, first of all, from the work that Anna and Van did before me. So a little about my book. I mean, so in my I guess my older career as a journalist, I spent a lot of time during the so-called Pyongyang testing campaigns that Kim Jong-un oversaw, missile tests, 3 nuclear tests, spending a lot of time writing primarily analysis pieces about the implications of every single new missile that Kim Jong-un was unveiling, including his ICBM. So I basically ended 2017 with a very significant corpus of sort of research writing, source material from a variety of interviews that I'd done with folks in and around the US government and in Korea. So I was just sitting on top of all of this information. And of course, interest in North Korea was sort of at an all-time high. But that in itself doesn't make a book. So the reason that ultimately I took a lot of what I had and decided that it would make sense to write a new book was, first of all, a conviction that I had that North Korea was no longer, I mean, and this was at the end of 2017, and this message really hasn't still sunk in the United States to many ends, that North Korea is a full-fledged new nuclear state. It is not the kind of non-proliferation problem that it was in the 1990s and the 2000s. Under Kim Jong-un, we've really seen North Korea sort of flourish and manifest itself as a nuclear state that does it all. They have a diversified set of nuclear capabilities. They've operationalized command and control. They have a sea-based nuclear capability. So I was sitting on all of this material, and I essentially wanted to sort of break down, how the nuts and bolts of North Korean nuclear strategy, the North Korean nuclear enterprise, have evolved from the days, from when the Yongbyon reactor went critical in 1986, all the way to the present day, and what that means essentially for Northeast Asian security and fundamentally the U.S. relationship with North Korea. After in 2017, 45 years after China tested its first ICBM, North Korea effectively became the 3rd country on Earth with a hostile relationship to the United States capable of ranging the US homeland with a nuclear weapon. And the implications of that, I think, were first of all very dangerous, as Van just explained. But ultimately, I think it did require an attempt, at least, to fully synthesize what this would mean for international security and security in Northeast Asia.
Thanks. North Korea is the most isolated country in the world, and I tip my hat to all of you for managing to penetrate the country, to get a sense of the man. And I want to ask you, before we get to the policy and substance of it, to tell us a little bit more about the color, the challenges of writing a book about the dynasty, about the country. Let me begin with Anna. You interviewed Kim's school friends, family servants, members of the family living in hiding. What did you learn about the man that might help us in the outside world understand how to negotiate with him?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest challenge for me was finding people who'd actually met him and who knew him and could tell us a little bit more about him beyond what we see on North Korean propaganda and things. And that was extremely difficult because so few people had met him, and the school friends who'd met him in Switzerland knew him for such a short period of time. There were only 4 of them really, and they had a limited number of stories to recycle over and over again. Obviously things changed a lot during the Trump administration, and suddenly many more people had met Kim Jong-un, but they were not willing to talk about it at that time because there was still hopes that this diplomacy might actually work. I think the thing that really struck me in the reporting and talking to his aunt and uncle who lived with him in Pyongyang and were his guardians in Switzerland was just how dysfunctional his childhood was. He lived in this completely sequestered compound in Pyongyang. He did not know the other half-siblings from his father's other relationships. He had no friends apart from his younger sister, Kim Yo-jong, and his older brother, Kim Jong-chol. He didn't go to school. He had nothing like a normal life. And in fact, at his 8th birthday party, when he was announced to real-life generals as the future leader of North Korea and named the little general, then these top military brass did actually salute him and bow to him. And his aunt told me it just became impossible for him to live anything like a normal life from that period on. So I guess the thing that really struck me is just how he, you know, had no chance to have anything like a normal upbringing, that he was raised from the get-go in this extremely strange, dysfunctional environment to be the person he is today. I mean, his brothers were also raised in this same way, but it was him who rose to the top and proved to be the one to take over the mantle.
I always wonder how he managed to do that, but we'll get to that in a minute. Van, maybe you can tell us a little bit about how you overcame the challenges of writing about a country so isolated and a leadership that is so inaccessible. I remember on my trip with Madeleine Albright how the team came back and briefed those of us flying with her and said, you know, we'd heard all these stories from other intelligence services that claimed that Kim's father had these blood transfusions from the blood of virgins. I mean, there's so many myths and stories out there. So I'm interested, how do you get to the point of understanding the reality rather than the myths of this country and this leadership? Van?
Yeah, it's a good question. My challenge was, of the three books here, I think mine is the least Kim Jong-un-y of the three. Not that that's a word, but like I was writing about a crisis as the crisis was ongoing. So I didn't know how the story ended, but I had a very clear deadline for the book. And it was a question of how I was going to put a bow on it, basically. And it just happened that my deadline was after the summit stuff had already started. So I got lucky in that respect. But the challenge was like this intense time crunch of writing and publishing and like parallel processing the publishing process, and then not knowing the future. Like, what is Kim Jong-un going to do? Is war going to break out? Is peace going to break out? You can't know that stuff, you know? What I could do is kind of proceed deductively, and I leaned on my like academic background quite a bit. So I could map out the choices facing Kim Jong-un. I had a sense, or I could give a sense of North Korean history and North Korean strategic culture and what made sense given those things. And then the crucial through line or the framework for the book was what I called this like pathways to nuclear war construct, which I laid out early in the book. And I said, basically, look, if war happens, it's going to go down in one of three distinct ways, right? Preventive war, conflict spiral, and then what I call the false positive war. And there are indicators we can observe to confirm that we're going down one or more of these pathways to war. And then as events unfolded, I was able to use that to kind of filter the events and like organize things. And that was the basis on which I was arguing that we were literally, you know, on the brink, right? Like nothing this dangerous since the Cuban Missile Crisis, particularly in Asia. It was because we were on all three pathways to war at the same time. And we, the U.S. had kind of lost control of the direction of things fairly early in the crisis. So I simultaneously decentered Kim Jong-un in favor of focusing on the structures that were shaping and shoving his choices. So that's how I sort of grappled with this, like I was contextualizing him. And it's kind of ironic because in my narrative, Kim also emerges as like the lead agent in all of this. Not so much because that was what I set out to do, but it was just what I was observing. Given tremendous constraints, given what the US was doing, he played a weak hand pretty well.
So, and tell us how you managed to determine what Kim really is like, what abilities he really has, and where the country stands. This is, again, how do you penetrate beyond it's the barriers it imposes to the outside world?
Absolutely. So I think in writing about North Korea, it's important to write about what you know and not write about what you don't know. I mean, that sounds like an obvious phrase, but I remember, an early conversation with my publisher, when there was sort of an interest in weaving out a narrative of how North Korea, specifically Kim Jong-un, thinks and conceives about things like nuclear deterrence, nuclear war. And we can say a few things about that, primarily based on what we see, of course, North Korea disseminate to the world, all of that, of course, coming in a highly curated way. But I wanted to focus on the things that I could really see and observe and understand. And I got lucky here. I mean, in North Korea's pursuit for effective deterrence, North Korea, like every nuclear state before it, has tried to convey that its capabilities are credible and they're real. And one of the ways that you do that without, inviting international experts in to come take a look at your nuclear weapons designs and missiles is public messaging, videos, flight testing missiles, footage, nuclear test analysis, seismic signatures from those nuclear tests. All of these things are things that we can study and understand and analyze. And of course, I'm not an expert in sort of all of these areas of analysis, but of course, the process of writing the book and the process of really reporting on North Korea in the lead up to this book project becoming a reality really involved getting myself very deeply acquainted with sort of the technical underpinnings of what North Korea would have to do to credibly practice deterrence. So that was a significant part of the book and the reporting. So it was a mix of sort of open source analysis, deductive reasoning, and sort of looking back at the history of honestly how the United States and the Soviet Union went about operationalizing their deterrence, certainly in the early days of the Cold War, and how other nuclear states have gone about solving some of the problems that Kim Jong-un needed to solve himself. And then on the flip side, the interviews were certainly a very important part of the analysis that ultimately went into the book, sort of getting a sense of the kind of understanding that the U.S. government has of various North Korean capabilities and how these sort of factor into American decision-making on things, including, but not limited to, a potential decision now or in the future to undertake military action against North Korea, the kind of factors that inform any U.S. government analysis of that. So that, again, I think was a facet that I think without which the book really wouldn't have been complete. So it was a mix of open and closed sources. And in fact, at the end of the day, I would say about 70%, 80% relying mostly on what is freely and openly available out there.
Thanks. So Anna, back to you. There were a lot of predictions after Kim took power, because he was so young, that his uncle would end up playing the regent-like role. But as we soon saw, Kim quickly eliminated his uncle and purged many of the senior officials from his father's regime. So as he consolidated power and developed his own leadership group to run the country, what do we learn about Kim Jong-un's playbook? How do you think he developed it, and how does it differ from both his father and his grandfather?
Yeah, I think Kim Jong-un was extremely shrewd in the way he approached the task of taking control of this regime. And that, he was 27 years old. There was no myth around him like there was around Kim Jong-il. The first Kim Il-sung, had 25 years to prepare the nomenclature and the populace for this transition of power to a second generation. But everything was extremely hurried with Kim Jong-un. They had barely 2 years to prepare the groundwork for him to take over. So he arrived at the tender age of 27 with no military myth or, very little propaganda around him. And what propaganda there was extremely far-fetched, like the idea that he could shoot a gun and drive a car when he was a small child, and things that ordinary North Koreans did not believe it, even they told me afterwards. But what he did, I think, he kept that old guard in power, the people who had supported his grandfather and his father before him, the people who knew where the money was, who knew how to run the regime, and he capitalized on that knowledge. So we look at people like the chief of the army, Ri Yong-ho, who was in control there, the propaganda chief, Kim Ki-nam. He kept all of these people, and of course his uncle, Jang Song-taek, who was in charge of relations with China and was, in charge of a lot of the money as well that went into the regime. he kept all those people around and took advantage of their institutional knowledge for as long as that was useful to him. And then one by one, he slowly dispatched with all of those people. The army chief disappeared, the propaganda chief disappeared. They may have been executed. They may have just been relegated to a gulag somewhere. We don't know exactly what happened to them. But with his uncle, he went a step further and did have him hauled out of this Politburo meeting in this very humiliating public way, which in itself was very surprising, that this is not the way that North Korea had traditionally run the mechanics of the regime. So he was really sending a message to the people, the loyalists who keep him in power, that nobody is safe in his regime, that not even his own uncle and someone who was considered to be a regent or somebody who was crucial to the running of the regime was safe under him. So he had Jang Song-taek hauled out, put on this trial, and then publicly executed. And there were reports that a lot of the top officials in the regime were forced to watch that. So, I mean, that sends a pretty powerful message to people to say, don't cross me, nobody is safe in my regime. And so we've seen that to varying degrees since then, that he has taken advantage of people's knowledge and then got rid of them when they either have served their purpose or when they have become a challenge to him. So, for example, with his brother, Kim Jong-nam, who it's almost 4 years now that he was assassinated, in Kuala Lumpur airport. He is somebody who never stood or never expressed much interest in taking over this regime. He was living a life in exile outside of the system, had been somewhat critical of the system, but still for Kim Jong-un, that was too close for comfort. I think he viewed him as a potential rival to the leadership because of the fact that he, could claim to have this mythical Paektu blood flowing through his veins and therefore could be a rival for the leadership. So the way that Kim Jong-un took over, I think, was by instilling fear into those loyalists who keep him in power, but also just quickly by creating this real kind of oligarchy in North Korea where the people who did support him and could be trusted at the top got very rich and corrupt under his leadership by being able to make money on the sides of their jobs. So I think it's this dual use of fear and instilling loyalty and enabling them to become rich that has enabled him to stay in power this long.
Thanks. Let me turn to Van. Fear has been a trademark of the Kim dynasty among all three of them. In what ways is Kim, in both his style and his approach, different from his father and grandfather?
Yeah, I mean, so first I would co-sign everything Anna just said, but then on top of that, Kim Jong-il, his father, was kind of famous for having a divide and conquer approach within the regime institutionally. So like pitting factions against each other and then serving as the arbiter or like the equilibrium of balance. And that's how he kind of stayed in power. And Kim Jong-un obviously did the opposite. It was power consolidation, centralization, wide-scale purges, and then installing loyalists, like Anna said. And all of that seemed to work pretty well. And it was very a marked shift from his father. The one big thing he did that I would just add is he got rid of the National Defense Commission, which was this all-powerful body, and replaced it with the State Affairs Commission, and substituted out a lot of the old cadre generals for basically civilians, brought into the mandate of this body to be about more than just national security. And so all of that was a big deal and enabled him to consolidate power at home. But then he had these ongoing priorities that he inherited when he came in, right? So part of it was power consolidation. You have to guard your flank internally. Part of it was you have to guard against, the Yankee imperialists or whatever. You see this, you're under siege from without, from external. And so you need nukes. This is obvious, right? And you still have this priority for economic growth or economic development of some kind. It's not clear how you do it, but he was pretty disciplined in pursuing these big macro goals. And then the thing that was innovative about him, or like unique about him, I guess, is that he was able to improvise a lot within whatever context or constraints that he got. The crisis was like the ultimate hard test of that. Trump is going to throw random stuff at you. How well are you going to adapt and improvise toward the goals that you clearly have in mind, right? So improvisation was this unique thing that he brought. And then he was kind of like a sultanistic leader, more cult of personality like than his father, much more similar to his grandfather in that respect, I guess. But it was this notion of using charismatic authoritarianism, right? So you're showing emotion in public, you're being, JFK to his father's Richard Nixon kind of thing. And that goes a long way, right? So if you're going to centralize leadership in yourself, it's probably a good thing to have charismatic authority. And so all of that is very different from at least his father, and in some ways his grandfather too.
It's quite a comparison, JFK to Richard Nixon. Ankit, let me turn to you. The excesses of Kim's life are so unbelievable. As Anna pointed out in her book, getting his first real car at the age of 7, being willing to murder his own brother, not just haul him off and execute him, but have him assassinated with a toxic nerve agent. It's just kind of, it's unimaginable the way he has lived and the things he's done. Does Kim, given his background, is privileged, does he understand the realities of the world at all?
Do any of us understand the realities of the world at all? I mean, I think let me take a step back there, though. I mean, I think Kim Jong-un, one of the things that we can, I think, determine based on the way he's conducted himself internally, and here again, I co-sign what my co-panelists said. One of the things I think is he is a fairly risk-acceptant leader. He understands that in order for North Korea to accomplish the objectives that he has sought out to accomplish, primarily externally, of late, I think the internal economic agenda in North Korea is not going according to Kim's plans, but he's accepted a very high degree of risk in many ways. I mean, the events of 2017, I think, point to that rather directly, sort of the direct brinksmanship with which Kim Jong-un was approaching a very new kind of U.S. president. I think a lot of evidence in early 2017 suggests that the North Koreans didn't quite realize that former President Donald Trump was not necessarily cast in the mold of his predecessors, that he may not behave as the North Koreans had come to expect American presidents to behave over the years. And on a similar note, I mean, the North Koreans have a very well-developed model of political leadership in the United States. They have expectations about how U.S. presidents will carry themselves, about how the U.S. military will behave under normal conditions in Northeast Asia. So under all of these constraints, as the United States entered a very unpredictable new era, I think Kim maintained a very high degree of acceptance of risk. And that, I think, has sort of persisted. And I think, just to go back to the point that Van made about Kim's similarities lying more with his grandfather than his father, I think we do see that again in the conduct of foreign affairs. I mean, under Kim Il-sung, North Korea was adept at playing off its two primary patrons against each other in many ways, China and the Soviet Union. Kim has sort of taken that playbook and is now in the process of, I think, adapting it to contemporary so-called great power competition, but also, like we saw in the 1960s with the so-called Second Korean War, the incidents that took place around the peninsula, including the seizure of the Pueblo, the shoot down of American reconnaissance aircraft. We saw a lot of threats of that nature from Kim Jong-un back in 2017, suggesting that North Korea was perhaps pushing the boundaries of what nuclear weapons might actually do. The kinds of capabilities, of course, that Kim Jong-un enjoys are something that his father nor his grandfather ever enjoyed. Neither Kim Il-sung nor Kim Jong-il ever truly presided over a nuclear state. They presided over an aspirational nuclear state. So Kim Jong-un, I think, has taken this and adapted it to a rapidly changing world.
So let me just follow with you, and when you talk about him being a risk taker, is he more of a risk taker than his grandfather was when you think about the Korean War?
I don't. Well, no, I don't think in that precise way. I mean, he's not a risk lover. The point that I was making is that he's more risk acceptant than in many ways that his father might have been. I think that manifests in the choices that we've seen North Korea make under Kim Jong-un's tenure so far.
So Anna, based on what we observed of Kim during the season of summits with President Trump, what do we get wrong about Kim Jong-un?
I mean, throughout that whole period, I think we saw, I mean, to follow up on what Van and Ankit was saying, that personality-wise, he is a very bold, audacious kind of leader in a similar vein to what his grandfather was, and very, very different to what his father was like. You know, in 17 years in power, Kim Jong-il spoke in public only once, and that was to utter a military slogan at an event. So to see Kim Jong-un out and about in this diplomatic setting and meeting the leaders of world powers, he showed himself to be very savvy and very adept in that situation in a way that I think was very surprising, because he had no experience of this kind of thing. So, I mean, one of the things that struck me was the way he was able to be self-deprecating and kind of turn on the charm almost with these leaders. So joking with Donald Trump about this looks like something out of a science fiction movie. When he hosted the head of the IOC, Thomas Bach, in Pyongyang during that year, he even joked about his weight and said, you know, it may not, they went to a soccer game together and said, it may not look like it, but I used to love playing sport when I was young too. So he showed himself to be able, I mean, these are obviously small anecdotes, but he showed himself to be able to play this kind of diplomatic game and to disarm people and to be able to be treated in a way like a, you know, he wanted to be seen as an international statesman, as somebody on a similar level to Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, Donald Trump. And so by playing along, by cajoling there, as well as being involved in this diplomatic process, he did look like an international statesman. That was something that was extremely useful for him back home in North Korea, to be able to splash this kind of propaganda across the state media and to say to North Koreans, look how internationally respected I am in the world, you know, you're so lucky to have me. And I really think that cannot be underplayed, the fact that he was able to do something that his grandfather and his father both wanted to do but were not able to do, and that was to be able to meet the American president and to stand almost shoulder to shoulder with him. So that was a very important thing. And I mean, even just to see the speed with which North Korea got these messages home. So this 45-minute documentary from Singapore was relayed back onto North Korean TV the very next day, you know, unusual speed for North Korea. I think just one more thing on the risk-taking thing, though, the fact that he was able to, he did go to Hanoi to that summit without having done the kind of preparation that you would have had expected, was a very, very risky move for him and could easily have backfired, because he was so public during this process, because he did announce to the North Korean people in advance that he was going to the summit and then came back basically empty-handed. So I think that was, an evidence of his personality traits at that time, but also something that was quite risky politically for him, and I'm sure was a bit dangerous internally at that time. I'll leave it there.
Van, let me ask you about the process of this diplomacy. Do you think Kim was surprised by the speed with which Trump was willing to engage with North Korea? And describe a little bit what you think was behind, or these love letters to Trump. Was this a con job? Was this false flattery? Was the, describe your take of this bromance.
Yeah, of course it was false flattery, first of all. The idea of Trump being anything other than a mark for Kim Jong-un, to me, is not serious. And I think that was one of the fatal flaws of the whole process, was that Trump went in thinking that he could be the charmer, not having any sense of his own blind spots. Like put preparation aside, put the prudence or not of doing these kinds of summits, put all that aside. Just the fact that like he thinks that it's like a one-way manipulation kind of thing out of his own hubris, when Kim Jong-un has every reason to be sort of reversing that, you know? And we know with other world leaders, like Trump is eminently manipulable, right? And Kim Jong-un got through 2017 successfully. You know, he faced down the devil and won. I think Ankit's point about risk acceptance is, you know, should be, you can't emphasize that enough. You know, I think he probably thinks he's a good gambler, and you see evidence of that in the way he handled the summits, improvising, meeting Trump's. It's the opposite of bravado at that point, because they're not insulting each other anymore, but meeting Trump's willingness to kind of go crazy on diplomacy in kind. You know, like I was actually surprised by that myself, that Kim Jong-un would take the risk of getting on a plane, meeting a world leader without having the proper preparations. And, you know, the considerations of like, how might all this look at home operationally? How can you even be sure about your own security when you're out abroad? Like there are all these questions that a more risk-averse person would collapse under the weight of, you know, and Kim Jong-un pressed on. So as we look at the summits and we look at the bromance, considering that they only met for these small windows of time, it's obviously strategic. Also, this is what you're supposed to do with diplomacy, you know, and it happens to be that the US president at the time was uniquely susceptible to flattery. This is not a controversial observation, man. And so I think we saw Kim Jong-un trying to play Trump, and Hanoi kind of exploded the second summit, but part of that was like a miscalibration of expectations on both sides. And it's possible that Kim Jong-un thought he could get more from Trump uniquely, Trump the man, than was even realistically possible, because he thought he was a good gambler. And so understanding this whole like risk acceptant mindset, I think helps us explain a lot of not just the fact that this summit process happened, but its implosion too.
So, Ankit, let's take this one step further. Based on what we now know about Kim Jong-un, how should the Biden administration deal with Kim and his regime? This will be quite a contrast. And it's striking that North Korea has not come up very much. And there were some who predicted, that Kim might try another test to kind of say, hey, I'm here, pay attention. So how does the Biden administration deal with Kim?
Well, we're all waiting to find out. And, you know, I'm willing to give the administration the benefit of the doubt on the ongoing policy review. That said, the indicators that we have seen, statements from Secretary Blinken, a few other senior officials, indicate that inertia, which is a powerful force in American bureaucracy and foreign policy in general, may take the day again. And by that, I mean that I don't think the United States will fundamentally revise the starting point for entering negotiations with North Korea, which is that ultimately negotiations have to manifest in North Korea's unilateral disarmament, that the North Koreans have nuclear weapons, they shouldn't have nuclear weapons, they should return to the Non-Proliferation Treaty as a non-nuclear weapon state in good standing. And once they've done all that, we will give them all the sanctions relief in the world and work towards building a peace regime on the Korean Peninsula, having a new kind of relationship with North Korea, and all that good stuff. That just isn't going to happen, right? I mean, the question that you that you asked about what we get wrong about Kim Jong-un, this probably isn't surprising for maybe many of the audience members and analysts in the North Korea watching community. But Kim Jong-un is not going to give up his nuclear weapons for any kind of finite economic incentives, precisely because the benefit that he gains from his nuclear weapons are effectively infinite, i.e. his own survival. You cannot put a finite price on something like survival, which is effectively infinite in the benefits that Kim derives from it. So what does that mean for policy? There's a spectrum of options here. It's not that, the United States has to simply give up and, give North Korea a gold star and welcome it to the club of nuclear power states. I mean, that's never going to happen, first of all, because there isn't really a way to do that in the international system, sort of being one of the 5 recognized nuclear weapon states under the NPT, which North Korea is never going to be. So what do you then do? I talk a lot about this in the book. In fact, the final 100 pages or so are highly prescriptive. My recommendation happens to be that we approach North Korea with more of an arms control mindset. Arms control, of course, traditionally has been something Americans only do with superpowers, and the only superpower we've really done it with is Russia and formerly the Soviet Union. Of course, we don't really do arms control with China today, so recommending arms control for North Korea tends to be a little bit much. But ultimately, I think that is the prescription here, especially in terms of moderating and managing the very real nuclear dangers that exist on and around the Korean Peninsula as a result of the advancements that North Korea has made. I will sort of close on a sort of counterintuitive note, which is that, we are witnessing North Korea. North Korea has spent a lot of its time since 2017 quietly, quantitatively building up its nuclear forces and qualitatively modernizing its nuclear forces. And what that means is that North Korea today is a much more sophisticated nuclear power, not only than it was 30 years ago, but than it was in 2017. And the good news for a crisis, at least, would be that a North Korea that has more nuclear weapons, more survivable nuclear weapons, may feel less threatened if the United States does decide that the only path forward will be confrontation. I'm hoping the Biden administration will recognize this reality and evolve American policy towards North Korea that recognizes these options. Of course, there are multiple interests here to be balanced, including engaging a nuclear-armed North Korea in a way that isn't fatal to the non-proliferation regime writ large. We have to think about how we can induce North Korea to take certain steps to practice mechanisms of restraint with the United States that can keep future crises bounded. And believe me, there will be future crises with North Korea. We're coming out of this phase of diplomacy where things really haven't gotten bad yet, but that possibility is very much still there.
We may get back to this issue of economic insecurity because that's the kind of yin and yang of the North Korea dilemma. Let me ask Anna, you're optimistic that a deal could cap, as you say, the growth of North Korea's program. How?
Well, I mean, since I wrote my book, a lot has changed, right? And the biggest thing I think is the pandemic, of course, and the impact that the COVID crisis has had on North Korea is far, far greater than any economic sanctions or external efforts against North Korea over the decades. And I mean, we don't know right now what the exact situation is inside North Korea. They closed the border more than a year ago with China before even Wuhan went into lockdown. So I think the situation in there must be quite dire. The fact that Kim Jong-un has been coming out recently and talking about mistakes that he's made is quite a signal there. So this presents an opportunity for the Biden administration, I think, to work more on the economic side and to look at what incentives they could offer North Korea to return to some kind of diplomacy in the future. I mean, but having said that, I agree with Ankit that there's no way North Korea is going to give up their nuclear weapons program. Kim Jong-un has put a lot of time and resources and invested his own kind of legitimacy in this nuclear weapons program, and I just can't see a way that he's going to negotiate that away for anything. I think the opportunity lies more in, and all of this assumes a post-pandemic world, which seems quite far away at the moment, but I would like to see more emphasis from the Biden administration on engagement away from nuclear talks and away from even some of the more traditional kinds of diplomacy. So that means, sporting exchanges, cultural exchanges. I was on the New York Philharmonic trip to Pyongyang in 2008, and it really felt like that, I mean, forgive the pun, but it did feel like it struck a chord in some way at that time. So I think kind of breaking down some of those barriers and building up some trust would be a way to maybe lay the groundwork for more interaction between the two systems in the future. I mean, having said that, North Korea has really limited the number of people that it is allowed to travel to Singapore for financial training or on sports trips to places, because it does view that as really dangerous. So I think that North Korea will try to limit this exposure to the outside world, but this is definitely something that I would like to see much more emphasis on in the future.
So Anna, let me follow up. You mentioned COVID-19. I'm just wondering, how bad is the pandemic in North Korea? Do we have any sense of both how the kind of infection rate, the kind of fatality rate, and what they're doing about it, since they obviously have no access to the vaccines yet?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's hard to kind of exaggerate how devastating this would have been if this virus had gotten into North Korea and traveled, because, I mean, I've been into North Korean hospitals that have no power in the middle of winter and things like that. There's no medicine in many of these hospitals at all. So they definitely could not have coped at all with an outbreak of the coronavirus inside North Korea. So we don't know to what extent the virus got into North Korea. It's hard to think that it didn't get in at all, given the level of trade and flow across that China-North Korea border. But I think it's fair to assume that there has not been a widespread outbreak of the coronavirus there, because we would have heard about it. It would have been so devastating that the news would have gotten out. I mean, and if there's one thing that North Korea knows how to do, it's how to isolate itself and how to order people to stay at home. So that does seem to be it doesn't seem to have been a devastating thing there. The thing is, yes, how do they get out of this? How do they get the vaccine? Does China give them their Chinese vaccine? How do they return to some kind of normal? Because 90% of North Korea's trade has gone to or through China, and that has really been the lifeline for the regime. So I think they will be extremely eager to get back to some kind of normal situation, at least with China, if not with the rest of the world.
Great. Enkit had mentioned the danger of crises ahead. So let me ask Van, you write about how close we came in 2017 to a nuclear showdown. And when some say the odds were 50-50, that it would have come to that. You served in the Obama administration in the run-up to this very close call. What do you think the prospects are that we get to a crisis that was that bad again, 50-50?
Yeah, I don't know if I would endorse those odds. I'm not an odds maker, but the thing that sucks about right now is, and the whole summit process, frankly, is that the conditions that gave rise to the crisis are the same as they were when Trump came into office in 2017. In many ways, it's worse because the nuclear missile programs have advanced, right? And if Trump, the Biden administration has a huge dilemma here, because on the one hand, to the extent that you consecrate and validate what the Trump administration was, right? Like, that's representative of America. We're going to keep the Singapore Declaration as the starting point for negotiations. You can make that choice, but that means you have to take the whole like Trump legacy with you, right? So Fire and Fury was also America, right? Or you could say Trump was a weird aberration and that's not how we're going to go. Fire and Fury was not us, right? But in which case you can't take the quote unquote good parts, like the Singapore Declaration, if you want to think of it as good, right? So there is a dilemma or a tension that Biden will have to resolve by default with like how we deal with the Trump legacy in relation to negotiations. But the fundamental problem, the structural problem, is that we could have a crisis based on who becomes the personality or who gives voice to North Korea policy. If we start saying nonsense and threatening annihilation again, which, you know, you get like President QAnon, that's not crazy, that could happen. In that case, we're right back to Fire and Fury 2.0, only with the North Korean nuclear arsenal that's way worse than in 2017, man. And with a Kim Jong-un, with a leader who is much more confident in his own ability to take risks and win than prior to 2017. So like, that's a dangerous situation. I don't think we're facing an imminent crisis right now. I think we have the conditions for crisis. I don't think Biden's going to be the guy who like mouths off with fire and fury, right? But we need to create a situation that inhibits the consequences of President QAnon coming in with Fire and Fury 2.0, to put it bluntly. And the policy choices that we make in relation to North Korea should have an eye on that. Let's make a situation so that an irresponsible leader doesn't come in and screw all of us, you know?
So I'm curious, and maybe Ankit can take this one. We're not going to get to that fire and fury point, but North Korea clearly is not high or visible yet on the Biden agenda. Does Kim just to continue to make his ballistic missiles and make his nuclear bombs, and you know, and we end up down the road realizing we haven't paid enough attention? I just wonder how this plays out. What the next what the next crisis is, or what the next intersection or the next diplomatic engagement. Especially, I want to address China down the road, but you may want to begin now looking at the tension between Washington and Beijing. You know, we are always counted on China being the one to leverage its pull or its standing with Kim. Will it be willing to do that down the road, or is that less and less a possibility? What do you think, Ankit?
Yeah, sure. So I'll start with the China angle, which is a little bit more straightforward to address. So the first few years of Kim Jong-un's reign in North Korea were actually a remarkable period of chilly ties between China and North Korea. It was really not until the March 2018 meeting between Xi Jinping and Kim Jong-un that we really began to see a reversal in that momentum. Of course, that doesn't change the fact that North Korea has always relied on China economically. It's the extent to which the political relationship between the two countries is actually false. You know, I mean, going back to your earlier question about what Americans tend to get wrong about North Korea, the biggest thing we get wrong, and the biggest thing you'll probably see presidential candidates get wrong on the debate stage, for instance, when North Korea comes up, is leaning on China to solve the problem. I mean, Kim Jong-un does not wake up and take his orders from Beijing. His father didn't do that. His grandfather didn't do that. That's just not how North Korea operates. They're ultimately, you might be cynical about their self-serving emphasis on self-reliance, but they do tend to behave rather skeptically when it comes to what outside powers want for them. So China right now, I think, will tend to see North Korea as a useful cudgel as great power competition between the United States and China intensifies in Asia. They would rather have a North Korea that is a problem for the United States than a problem for China. And this, of course, I think will be something that we will continue to see over probably the entirety of Biden's first term. An anniversary that I'm watching this year is, July marks the 60th anniversary of the 1961 China-North Korea Treaty, which under Kim Jong-un, North Korea has been remarkably silent about. At least last time it was acknowledged was 5 years ago. So I'm curious to see if the North Koreans will acknowledge that treaty, which does include a mutual defense provision where China is supposed to defend North Korea in an arms conflict, although that might change now given that the North Koreans have their own nuclear weapons. And the first part of your question on what is likely to happen, are the North Koreans just going to hum along and keep building their capabilities? So we just heard from Kim Jong-un at the onset of January at the 8th Party Congress, and he sort of addressed a very wide-ranging agenda of nuclear modernization. I mean, the kind of things he mentioned were basically tailor-made to get the attention of the U.S. intelligence community, and I'm sure President Biden's presidential daily briefs have included all sorts of details on what North Korea is building. Of course, it didn't seize the news cycle since the Eighth Party Congress did happen to coincide with the insurrection in Washington on January 6th. But Kim Jong-un is talking about tactical nuclear weapons, something that North Korea has not yet developed or deployed. He's talking about hypersonic gliders, solid propellant intercontinental range ballistic missiles. I mean, really, things that are designed to get the attention of anybody working the North Korea portfolio. But of course, as we know, on the nonproliferation and nuclear policy front, the Biden administration's first agenda item was the extension of New START with Russia. That's been done. The JCPOA with Iran is, I think, where the Biden team is planning on spending a lot of political capital. So until that's squared away and until the relationship with Iran is either more stabilized to a point where, either the JCPOA hopefully is extended, I don't think the Biden team will be, putting its neck out there to expend a ton of political capital on some kind of bold outreach to North Korea. And so if you're Kim Jong-un, what do you do with this? I don't want to say that Kim Jong-un's not going to test a missile anytime soon. They tend to keep things quiet during presidential transitions. In 2016, the last missile test that year took place during the third presidential debate, and we didn't see any major missile tests until Donald Trump entered the Oval Office. And it was, I believe, February 13th, 2017, when the North Koreans kicked off the year's missile testing. So that could happen, as early as next week. And March tends to be a busy month for the North Koreans, who like to stage, they like to stage their own version of joint or military exercises as the United States and South Korea carry out their field mobilization exercises, which will again be downgraded due to the pandemic. But ultimately, I think if the policy review is finalized and you hear the president simply announce a very familiar sounding North Korea policy, we will hold out for the complete, verifiable, and irreversible dismantlement of North Korea's weapons of mass destruction. I think that's the point at which Kim Jong-un will go back to his more traditional playbook, where he incrementally ramps up the heat, demonstrates new capabilities, demonstrates things like potentially tactical nuclear weapons, multiple reentry vehicles and ICBMs and what have you, intending to signal to the United States that that time essentially is not on Washington's side. That time is on Pyongyang's side. Of course, I think the internal economic situation in North Korea is perhaps going to suggest to some in the Biden administration that time is on the United States side, right? I mean, sanctions haven't worked in North Korea, but what we've seen over the last year in many ways amounts to a natural experiment in what real maximum pressure looks like. I mean, the kind of pain that the North Koreans have put themselves under is significantly greater than the pain that they've endured under Kim Jong-un, under the sanctions regime. So that, I think, paints a pretty complicated picture right now. I could see Kim Jong-un, making a decision tomorrow to launch a ballistic missile, or hold out and wait to see where the policy review comes down.
Let me just say, as someone who follows Iran closely, that if North Korea policy or decisions or announcements depend on the pace of developments on Iran, don't hold your breath. This is a very complicated issue, and far more complicated, I think, than many understand. So, Anna, you're such a good observer of the kind of human condition. Let me follow up on the issue of sanctions. I having covered South Africa and Rhodesia and Iran sanctions and so forth. Sanctions is a very, very slow moving tool, and it clearly has done very little to deter many of these governments. What kind of impact do you think sanctions have had, and can North Korea endure the punitive economic measures indefinitely, even if they get tougher?
Well, it's hard to imagine how much tougher they could get because under the Trump administration, the sanctions were really ramped up so that, a lot of North Korea's exports like seafood, textiles, labor were all banned. And, probably because of the coronavirus and pandemic and things, I think a lot of those workers in China and Russia would have returned to North Korea as well. So, I mean, a lot of what the US had been trying to lead against North Korea in terms of sanctions was already in place. And we have seen that all of these generations of sanctions did not have any impact on, first of all, the development of the nuclear and ballistic missile program. Kim Jong-un was able to advance both of these programs despite, supposed restrictions on his ability to get parts and also financing to be able to get those parts. So he made astonishing progress despite the sanctions regime. But we've also seen that Kim Jong-un himself has been able to get around the sanctions, and he's been flouting it by showing up in Singapore and at these various summits and brand new late model Mercedes Benzes, a Rolls Royce when he met Secretary Pompeo. So it's not just the little things, the Swiss watches and things that are, and the money that's getting across the border, but big things as well have been able to get through. So I think there he has found a way to continue to survive and thrive and make sure that the people who keep him in power have been able to get what they need and to be able to have that sense of largesse despite the sanctions regime. I mean, the area where it has really hurt has been with the ordinary people, and that a lot of things that they would need for their daily life, and a lot of the low-level trade, illegal trade that crosses the border between China and North Korea had been curtailed or had become a lot more difficult as a result of the sanctions. So I think, it's pretty clear in North Korea that sanctions have hurt the people and not the leadership. And in fact, the leadership, as in many authoritarian countries, has been able to blame the United States and sanctions for a lot of their own economic mismanagement. Kim Jong-un has repeatedly said that North Korea's issues are due to, the hostile American policy and not because of any, shortcomings in his own leadership there. So it's provided a pretty easy foil for them. Just one thing, obviously the seafood exports and the things like that is a significant source of income for North Korea. But I think that the labor exports is something that is not so cut and dry, that under Kim Jong-un, there has been this huge increase in the number of North Koreans being sent abroad to work, whether it's in clothing factories in China or in forestry or construction in Russia, or even building soccer stadiums in the Middle East. And this is quite controversial because it is, tantamount to slave labor in a way, because these people are kept in dormitories, they're highly controlled, they're often not paid properly or what they're supposed to be able to get. But still, this is something that is very attractive to North Korean people, because even despite these conditions in the outside world, it's preferable to being inside North Korea, where their lives are similarly curtailed, but they don't have that opportunity to earn as much money. So you see a lot of North Koreans had been actually bribing officials for the right or for the chance to go abroad and to work, 18-hour days locked into a dormitory in China, because that was a way to be able to earn more money. So you see people like Andrei Lankov was talking very much in favor of this kind of labor working abroad situation, because it was a situation that was life-changing for North Koreans, that when they returned to North Korea with some thousands of dollars, they were able to start businesses or to overhaul their own lives inside North Korea, and thereby reduce the state's ability to control their life, to reduce their dependence on the state. So sanctions on things like that, I think, are much less cut and dry than, say, cutting off coal exports or things like that. I think that is what part of the reason that China and Russia have been unwilling to really enforce those kinds of sanctions.
Thanks. I think we're going to welcome the audience to offer questions too, and I think someone's going to forward me questions that I can ask the panel. I want to follow Van with what Anna's point. There has been greater, larger labor force allowed to work elsewhere in the world, and we know that the kinds of technology and videos and so forth have crossed from China into North Korea, that the population in general is much savvier today than a generation ago about what's happening elsewhere in the world. I'm not suggesting a Pyongyang spring anytime soon, but is there a sense that whether it's the level of education, access to the outside world, and knowing what is happening elsewhere, that that this is not an environment, political environment that can endure indefinitely, that there is at some point going to be, whether it's movement or rippling effect, you know, signs of disgruntlement and discontent that are more, maybe not visible to us, but maybe more visible to Kim.
Yeah, I mean, nothing's impossible, but I just can't, it doesn't seem very likely, right? Like a civil society uprising or like an insurrection within North Korea. Part of the issue here is that, you know, North Korea as a regime, they kind of operate the best practices of like the dictator's handbook. And one of the very underappreciated things that like Kim Jong-un brings to his regime is this, like, I call it like flexibility or like the savvy dictatorship, right? It's this ability to adjust and adapt your prevailing narrative of social control to account for external realities, because the Andrei Lankov theory of change, socialization and exposure to new things, that can only work. It's only possible for that to work when the new information is a disjuncture with whatever that internalized narrative is. And so it's actually a big deal when Kim Jong-un comes out and weeps in front of everybody. He's like, oh my God, I messed up the economy, guys, but here's what we're gonna do now. Because it's like, he's coming across as like excessively candid, which creates automatic buy-in. Again, this is like within a post-totalitarian state, but like, so like, don't, I'm not trying to like overstate things here, but like within context, he's being more candid, which brings people along, and it kind of deflates the impetus for like revolutionary change inside the system, you know? And we've seen from the 90s that the North Korean people can eat a lot of grass, basically. They can suffer pretty well. They can tolerate it. And so the fact that Kim Jong-un can like make tweaks to his internal narrative in a way that makes it harder for people to point out, to juxtapose internal and external realities, I think that's not a trivial thing. And then on top of that, since Kim Jong-un came to power, all of these purges and all that stuff, installing loyalists, he has been centralizing control of the state security institutions, right? Like internal security forces. And that's the system that enforces his rules. It's the system of social control, right? It's the system of fear imposition. And by centralizing it, he makes it more effective. So Sheena Chestnut-Greitens has a book about like dictatorships and how they will choose to optimize these coercive institutions of state security for either divide and conquer to coup-proof their regime, right? They're afraid of elites, or they're afraid of the populace, right? And they create centralized control to have powerful coercive institutions to suppress dissent internally at a mass level. And Kim Jong-un has gone much more toward that latter, right? It's the mass dissent that he's girded himself against with consolidation of state security and centering himself on it. So like he's done much less of the coup proofing in the way that his father did. And so like in that context, are you really going to expect people to rise up? I don't think so. It doesn't make sense. But I mean, anything could happen. I didn't predict COVID either, so.
It looks like we might have a technical difficulty with Robin's connection here. I'm just going to jump in with some questions that come in as well. We're editing and grouping them. One comes from Kevin Kim, and it's about the arms control piece. And we'll direct this one to you, Ankit. Kevin asks, what makes you believe that Dprk would be amenable to arms control, particularly considering the stringent verification protocols required? A very easy one there for you.
Super easy, but no, but it's a great question. I mean, Yeah, I mean, the V word, verification, is really probably one of the worst things you could say to a North Korean in many ways, right? I mean, the IAEA left North Korea last in April 2009. They haven't returned. Verification and sort of the kind of access that we have, for instance, in Iran is almost unthinkable in North Korea. But, I mean, let me just reflect a little bit on what arms control is and isn't, or really on what the purposes of arms control are. I mean, the way I see it, arms control can help build confidence between two sides that practice it. It can reduce the costs of competition during peacetime, both for North Korea and the United States, right? If you're an American worried about great power competition with China and you want to have less to think about on the Korean Peninsula, then you should favor arms control with North Korea, for instance. And finally, in the case that deterrence does fail, practicing effective arms control can reduce the consequences of that happening, i.e., ensuring that any conflict on or around the Korean Peninsula remains as bounded as possible. And arms control doesn't necessarily need to manifest in the sort of traditional kind of New START way where, we bring North Koreans to American soil to count American nuclear weapons, and then we send Americans to North Korea to count North Korean nuclear weapons. That just won't work given the lack of parity, first of all. The North Koreans are in a completely different just weight class when it comes to being a nuclear power. But ultimately, you can do a lot of confidence building steps, right? I mean, just things like, even in peacetime, moderating the kinds of activities that the United States undertakes to practice assurance for our allies. We love to, for instance, fly bombers to the Korean Peninsula. Restricting those flights, which is something that the North Koreans have repeatedly called for, and still practicing effective rapid reaction deterrence on and around the peninsula, I think is doable. Is that arms control? I would argue yes, even if it's not arms control in sort of the traditional sense of counting things and focusing on numbers. The other thing, I mean, we talked a little bit about sanctions policy. I concur with my co-panelists on the efficacy of sanctions. One of the things that I am quite looking forward to is the Biden administration at the Treasury Department is undertaking a comprehensive review of U.S. sanctions policy around the world. So I'm hoping that that leads to an approach on the Korean Peninsula where we recognize that sanctions, even if they won't get North Korea to change its behavior, nevertheless are useful pieces of leverage that we can asymmetrically trade away for North Korean restraint, or at least behaviors of restraint, things that could manifest in more responsible and more predictable North Korean behavior in a crisis. That too, I would argue, is arms control. So these kinds of things, I think, we need to think about with a very open mind, thinking of arms control sort of in the broadest possible sense and what that means for North Korea. But, a corollary of all this is that we just need to break out of this non-proliferation mindset when it comes to the Korean Peninsula. And non-proliferation is important, don't get me wrong. Nobody wants to see an Iranian nuclear weapon anytime soon. But on the Korean Peninsula, specifically in North Korea, the problem now is one of managing and living with a nuclear-armed North Korea and recognizing the dangers that stem from that.
Okay, now turning to our dream team, the 100% representation from the North Korean analyst community in New Zealand. As a question to Anna and Van. This comes from Suyeon in Ohio. Given Kim Jong-un's growing health concerns, should Kim Jong-un die an untimely but natural death? What is your reading of how the current structure of the North Korean regime and society might respond? And then added to that, who can you expect to succeed him? Starting with Anna.
Yeah, well, remember, the reason I wrote my book in the first place was because I was wrong, because I didn't expect Kim Jong-un or the third generation Kim to be able to take over. So I've learned not to predict the imminent collapse of North Korea if Kim Jong-un or the leader was to die. But having said that, it did seem like very tenuous that first time round, and it was really hanging in the balance. And there really is now no heir apparent for Kim Jong-un. With his various health scares over the past few years, there has been a lot of conjecture about his sister. I never really thought that it could be his sister, Kim Yo-jong, who would take over from him because she is even younger, and of course because she's female, and I didn't think that North Korea would be able to tolerate a young woman taking control of this. But having said that, I think it can't be anybody but Kim Yo-jong. There is nobody else. There is no, his children are very, very young. And, maybe toddlers, maybe just starting school age. So there really is nobody other than her to take over. I mean, I would just be getting into the realm of speculation to talk more on this, but I guess one of the things that does surprise me so much about Kim Jong-un is that he has expended so much effort to stay in power. He has done so many difficult things to try to make sure that he does defy all of these expectations. And yet he is clearly such an extremely unhealthy man that he is not doing any of the obvious things that you would expect to try to ensure his longevity, like, exercising and watching what he eats. So, I mean, I'm no doctor, but he doesn't look like a healthy man to me. So I'm surprised that he's not doing more to do the one thing that could ensure his definitely ensure that he stayed around for longer.
Thanks, Anna. It looks like Robin's able to join us. Robin, I'm just going to wrap up with this question to Van and then turn it back to you, Robin. And if you, I'll direct you to the Q&A tab. There are some of the questions listed up ready to go for you. So Van, over to you. And perhaps a spin in terms of, this is a different type of regime structure we've seen with the 88th Party Congress and some of the other moves. You look at the personal touches of Kim Jong-un to this regime. So also from that vantage point, the same question in terms of an untimely but natural death, what do you see playing out in terms of the succession?
Yeah, I think Anna's basically right about this, although we're all just kind of speculating. The truth is the dude is just so unhealthy. He's going to die, man. He's going to die, and it's going to be sooner than we think, possibly sooner than some of us would like, right? Doesn't mean it's tomorrow, but in the scheme of things, that's probably how we should be thinking about it. Dude is going to die, okay? Kim Yo-jong makes sense. Everybody thinks like, well, she's a woman, no experience. Kim Jong-un was the youngest son in a Confucian culture. He's a millennial and he's run the place like a boss. So like you can't, anything is possible if Kim Jong-un can be the great successor. You know what I mean? Anything's possible.
I like that image, a millennial with nuclear armed ICBMs. Maybe as a millennial, he'll lose interest and figure something else out. Kevin Kim just texted in the chat box that added to that, it's a really stressful job. Robin, if you're able to connect, I will hand it back to you for the Q&A portion. Okay, it looks like we're still having some technical difficulties there. But the next question we have, and this is a little bit of a lighthearted one. This comes from Allison in Los Angeles. And this is to all of you, but I'll start off with Ankit. She asks, you all have titles for your books that ring of a classic. What was the runner-up title that didn't make the cut? And starting with Ankit.
Oh, that's an easy one. I wanted to call the book Treasured Sword, with probably the same subtitle, Survival and Deterrence in North Korea. My publisher advised against it for, I think, good reasons. First of all, you'd have to read the book to know what treasured sword means. It's what the North Koreans euphemistically refer to their nuclear forces as, or sacred sword, depending on the translation that you like to use. But I just find that phrase evocative and sort of capturing the prized position of nuclear weapons in North Korean national security strategy.
Thank you. Next to Van.
So I did have another title that was very academic and boring, and I don't even remember what it was. But my one request was not to put Trump's name in the title, and my request was denied because at the time when the publication process was happening in the publishing industry, there was nothing that would sell more than putting Trump's name in the book on the title, But like then it was overkill very quickly. It jumped the shark, and by late 2019, nobody wanted to buy a book if it had Trump's name in it. So I'm stuck with the way it is, but I did not want it to be thus.
Good stuff. And to wrap it up on this particular round, over to Anna.
Yeah, so I had always envisaged my book being called The Great Successor, which is how Kim Jong-un was introduced, from the get-go. So that was my working title, and it remained the title. The issue for me was the subtitle, which which of course has to be like 25 words long in the current publishing market. So my working subtitle was something like The Secret Rise and Surprising Rule of Kim Jong-un. But my publisher in the US wanted to go for something much snappier and more, I guess, that hits on the absurdity or the ridiculousness of North Korea's own system. And so that he came up with a version of what it is today, which is, hold on, wait. I've suddenly forgot my own book title. Brilliant Comrade Kim Jong-un. So I had a lot of misgivings about that, and also about the image on the front as well, which is a kind of cartoon thing, because the whole thesis of my book is that he's not a joke, to the North Korean people, and he's proven not to be a joke to the outside world, and so we should be taking him seriously. But so, yeah, so I was a little uncomfortable with that American edition. But the British version, which is the one we have here in New Zealand, is a much straighter subtitle, which is The Secret Rise and Rule of Kim Jong-un, and it has just a photo of him on the front. So much straighter for the more sober British / New Zealand / Australian audience.
Good stuff. Thank you. Let's try one more time. Robin, are you able to connect?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Loud and clear.
I apologize to everyone. My computer crashed completely, and so I went to my laptop and it lost internet. I mean, our technology age in the middle of a pandemic is not always reliable. I don't know whether any of you have answered this question, but I'm kind of curious. Is there any challenge from either inside or outside the regime to the Kim dynasty? You know, this is where we saw in places like Egypt and Syria an uprising, even Libya under Gaddafi, we saw an uprising we didn't anticipate. And again, I go back to my question before. I don't suggest that there's anything imminent, but where could this come from? Especially if we get to a point that Kim does die from bad health and his successor is even younger, or he relies on his sister. You know, where do you see that kind of confluence of factors that produces change that might be unexpected? Anna, do you want to start?
Oh, sorry.
Any of you.
Over to you, Van. You were going to get in there.
Okay. Yeah. It's weird. The virtual protocol of like, oh, no, you, not me. No. It's hard to do. So I would just say briefly, it doesn't feature in these conversations normally, but the Free Joseon movement is this intellectually fascinating wild card in all of this. And it's definitely a marginal, non-serious player at the moment. But there's an alternative future, and South Korea, every South Korean I've ever talked to kind of chafes at the notion that like this outside group would be able to claim legitimacy over North Korea when North Korea should be part of South Korea, you know? So like there's an internal Korea thing happening there that makes it even more difficult than normal. But there's a scenario where you have these like North Korean overseas migrants, like a transnational diaspora kind of thing. And you have this Free Joseon movement that's trying to organize, you know, we're the government in exile kind of pose. Under the right confluence of factors, that could create serious problems for North Korea, particularly as North Koreans inside North Korea find out about it. And so that's very volatile. So it's like high potential in good ways and bad, largely bad. But like right now, it's not really a thing. Like there's a reason why nobody talks about Free Joseon, is because like they're not a power player, they're not really a factor, and it makes South Korea angsty.
So does anyone want to weigh in on that question?
Yeah, I would just add to that. I mean, it's really hard to exaggerate just how controlled the discussion is inside North Korea. So there is no Samizdat literature, there is no dissent, there is no graffiti even inside North Korea. So, you know, people who are watching South Korean dramas and listening to music that are coming in on USB drives and things like that is one thing. And that is kind of tolerated to an extent by the regime. But anything remotely political is, I mean, first of all, people don't seem to be that interested. You know, young North Koreans want to watch saccharine South Korean soap operas. They don't want to read, you know, Wikipedia or listen to some of this political stuff that's going on. So a lot of the stuff just doesn't get passed around, but also that political stuff and news from the outside world is extremely dangerous inside North Korea and is considered a political crime. And so the system of fear and control that Kim Jong-un continues to operate to this day just makes that kind of any kind of discussion about why they're spending so much money on nuclear weapons when people are, you know, malnourished, just impossible in North Korea, because yes, you yourself may be willing to stand up and sacrifice yourself to criticize Kim Jong-un in that system or question the system in some way, but because they still practice guilt by association, you know, this means that 3 generations of your family would also be punished, you know, often sent to a political labor camp for decades if you were to question the system at all. And so when I've been talking to North Koreans who have escaped from the country, and I've said to them, you know, why is there no kind of revolution? Why is there no dissent or protest? They all point to this, the fact that it's just so dangerous for your whole family to question the system in any way, that if you disagree with it, you don't try to change it, you try to escape from it.
So we have a question, and I'm not sure whether this has been asked or not, but we have a question from Ambassador Kathleen Stevens, who asked about how does Kim Jong-un regard South Korea? Does he harbor any thought of reunification? And what are his concerns and objectives with South Korea? Ankit, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. So I think, you know, we saw a lot of optimism. I mean, I was in Seoul at the end of 2018, and, you know, the talk of the town at the moment was, you know, not if Kim Jong-un was coming to town, but when he was coming to town. There was just a remarkable feeling of euphoria with the diplomacy that took place in 2018. You know, we all remember images of Kim Jong-un and his wife doing, you know, finger hearts on top of Paektusan with Moon Jae-in. I mean, just remarkable images. But frankly speaking, I mean, I think the relationship with South Korea under Kim Jong-un, I mean, pre-2018 and now after the optimism is sort of worn off, is fundamentally competitive. The note of reunification is, of course, the all-encompassing, never-ending debate that's highly controversial among Korea watchers. The optimists, you know, tend to see the objectives of the North Korean state under Kim Jong-un as being somewhat recalibrated from Kim Il-sung's era, which very much, I think, was practically focused on reunification as an achievable goal, I mean, especially through the 1970s until the agreement that decade between the two Koreas. But under Kim Jong-un, I mean, I think we see a different kind of competitive relationship. We see sort of arms racing dynamics between the two Koreas. You know, if the South Koreans do something, the North Koreans will try to replicate that specific capability. Many of the new missile systems the North Koreans have recently demoed resemble South Korean missile systems. So, you know, there is some degree of parallelism there. Anna talked about a little bit, you know, the architecture in Pyongyang under Kim Jong-un. I mean, you know, Ramyong Street, where North Korea's top scientists involved with the missile program are allotted residences, is designed to emulate the impressive high rises of Seoul. So Kim Jong-un, I think, recognizes that for North Korea to survive ultimately in the 21st century, it will have to sort of make a case for itself on the Korean Peninsula as a state that deserves to exist alongside South Korea. So I think in terms of that fundamental competitive relationship, he does see South Korea as a rival to directly compete against. And ultimately, I think you know, this dynamic will continue to play out. He's also, I think, particularly savvy at sort of manipulating and playing the internal political scene in South Korea. You know, we'll have to see how Kim Jong-un will adapt if a conservative does return to power in South Korea. But certainly, I think the transition from Park Geun-hye to Moon Jae-in, Kim Jong-un managed that sort of with an adept understanding of where the political waves were going in South Korea. So that, again, is something that I'd highlight.
Great. So we're nearing the end. I think we're supposed to stop at 5:20, and I want to give each one of you a last chance to have a few minutes to reflect. If you were sitting at the National Security Council in the new Biden administration, what 2, 3, 4, 5 things would you urge the administration to be doing now, even if there is not direct engagement? What does it need to lay the groundwork for? And what does it need to prepare for in the event there is some kind of engagement or some kind of diplomacy in the future? Anna, let's begin with you.
Oh, wow, that's a tough one. I mean, assuming that the whole world gets vaccinated and this pandemic comes to an end sometime soon, I think, I mean, and the reason which you alluded to before, Robin, that I was a bit optimistic about the Trump effort at diplomacy was because it was unconventional, and that conventional diplomacy had not worked over decades. So I thought it was fair enough to try something different. I mean, obviously it didn't work out. Obviously it was very different. But I think that there needs to be more creativity when it comes to dealing with North Korea. And so, as I mentioned before, I think making this not just a transactional thing about nuclear weapons, but trying to create a broader relationship, and particularly one that is focused on exposing as many North Koreans as possible to the outside world, is something that could be really beneficial and could perhaps tip the balance. I mean, we don't know. And I'm not just talking about like the ordinary people. I mean, there's been a lot of discussion previously about having officials going out into the outside world, but I think the more North Koreans of all stripes go into, I'm not talking about the US either, or Europe or something like that, but I thought it was genius to have that summit in Singapore. And I've been on a couple of the Chosun exchange courses in Singapore, where you've had North Korean economists and scientists and things walking around the place, and seeing a country that is Asian and a little bit authoritarian in its own way, that is identifiable in a way and aspirational. I think that's why Kim Jong-un agreed to Singapore for that first summit, and why there was that documentary showing the high rises of Singapore, and showing this is something that North Korea could be aiming for. I think those kinds of things could open people's eyes to what could be possible, and hopefully empower them to bring that about in some way. I remember when the Kaesong Joint Industrial Complex was operating, and somebody I knew in Pyongyang went to visit and took his North Korean staff there. And the thing that they talked about in the car the entire way back to Pyongyang was not the sewing machines or the electricity or anything like that. It was the toilets. You know, they were amazed at the flushing clean inside toilets. And so it's really difficult to tell, you know, what things are going to make an impression on people, and where, you know, where that's going to meet critical mass and empower people to make a change inside their system. So, I mean, that's not 4 or 5 things that I would do, but I would just be looking at more creative ways, you know, of engaging North Korea and accessing different people, exposing more North Koreans to the realities of the outside world. Because the fact is that North Korea has survived for so long by isolating itself, by cutting its people off, by feeding them the steady diet of propaganda. So anything you can do to beam information into North Korea, to bring people out, I think is all something that we should be pursuing more assiduously over the next few years.
That reminds me of going to see Stalin's hometown and his home a few years ago in Georgia, and they took us to the railway car that Stalin used because he was afraid of flying, which reminds me a little bit of Kim too. And the one thing they kept pointing out was this toilet, that Stalin's toilet, which he insisted on being the most modern version. So it apparently toilets do have an impact on diplomacy. Sorry for the digression. So Van, what are your 2 or 3 or 4 thoughts that things the Biden administration can do to get things going or prepare for the future?
Yeah, I mean, so toilets are important. I would co-sign that. In addition, I mean, like the thrust of Anna is correct here, right? Engagement is obviously the answer. The problem is that the way we've defined down what engagement is to be basically this kabuki, obligatory working level interaction where we're hyper stiff and our demands are, there's no win set. Like there's nothing in our demands that make it conceivably doable, credible, realistic. That's not really engagement, you know? So like widening the aperture on what that means for sure. What I would say instead of like 4 or 5 things though, is 4 or 5 analytical assumptions. No matter what Biden does, there needs to be a common set of knowledge and working level assumptions, right? To make sound policy. You know, one is that North Korea responds to pressure with pressure. Know this, got a book about it. I sort of have 2 books about it. Know this, pressure for pressure, okay? 2, Kim Jong-un thinks he's a good gambler. I've said this before, but he faced down the devil in 2017. We have to take into account that he may be risk prone because of experience, right? 3, China is not the answer. It has never been the answer. And the more that we think that China is the solution to the North Korea problem, the more we are misreading the regime, right? 4, deterrence is working, man. There is no such thing as deterrence being in a process of failing. So do not fall into the trap of doing aggressive stuff in the name of deterrence. That is self-defeating, okay? And then finally, the most important priority in Korea, Ankit said it, is avoiding nuclear war. We have other interests in Korea, but nothing is more important than avoiding nuclear war. When you look at what we've actually done as policy for the last 30 years, that is not our priority, and it needs to be. Our policies should reflect our priorities. So like whatever Biden does, if it's anchored in those assumptions, I think we'll be fine. If it deviates from those assumptions, we're in trouble.
Great. So Ankit, you get the last word on recommendations. And I will just add to that. Do you actually think Kim is really interested in the kind of accommodation with the United States that the United States would accept? So if you can address both of those, that'd be great as our final word.
Sure. I mean, so, you know, to address that last question, I mean, it fundamentally depends on what President Biden is willing to accept as the bottom line in North Korea, right? I mean, you know, I would encourage the president to sort of plan in terms of what is realistically attainable on the Korean Peninsula by the end of his first term. He might get a second term, no one knows yet. But, you know, focusing on a realistic agenda, I mean, the first thing, just to really get down to the nuts and bolts right now, you know, in December 2019, Kim Jong-un renounced his April 2018 moratorium on long-range missile and nuclear testing. It is absolutely in our interest, in South Korea's interest, in Japan's interest, in the interest of the international community at large, for Kim Jong-un to return to that moratorium and abstain from testing all of, you know, his new weapon systems that he was talking about at the 8th Party Congress recently. There's a reason Kim Jong-un, you know, brought that up, and that transcript of 14,000 words was translated and made available for the outside world to peruse as much as we'd like. Qualitatively, sort of keeping North Korea's nuclear advancement limited is absolutely in our interest. It not only facilitates practicing effective and smart deterrence on the Korean Peninsula, but it also makes the task of eventually engaging in risk reduction, arms control, whatever you want to call it, with North Korea, ever so slightly more realistic and possible. So once that's done, I think COVID-19 does sort of introduce a new wrinkle to the diplomatic environment. I mean, traditionally during a presidential transition, you would have track 1.5 exchanges between the United States and North Korea. It's my understanding that those have really not happened this time around, primarily given North Korea's guidance to its own diplomats because of COVID-19. So it means that with the new administration coming in, we have even less understanding, or at least the North Koreans will understand less about where the Biden administration is going. That means you got to be bold in how you signal publicly. And that means, I think that means that when the policy review is completed, again, I'm not going to prejudice, where that's going to come out. I think, again, giving the administration the benefit of the doubt on that, it will be important to communicate where that policy review is meaningfully different from the previous 30 years of American policy. And my hope is that it will be different. Just going back to what Van said, we cannot lose sight of the fact that the reality on the Korean Peninsula today has manifested in a unpleasantly high risk of nuclear war being a real probability. And right now we're not in a crisis, but we need to plan for the next crisis. And that means thinking through the kinds of activities that we do in peacetime that could result in the North Koreans potentially miscalculating, thinking about what the growing survivability of North Korea's nuclear forces might mean for how North Korea might reason and behave in a crisis. Partly where I might differ with Van's analysis is I think 2017 was a uniquely terrible time precisely because it just so happened that when North Korea crossed that threshold of attaining an ICBM capability, sort of qualitatively capping its nuclear forces, Donald Trump happened to be president of the United States, right? I mean, those two factors just uniquely made for a very dangerous crisis, because especially when a new nuclear state crosses important thresholds like North Korea did in 2017, that's when things like use or lose pressures in a crisis are particularly acute, and command and control is rusty and not well developed. And as time proceeds, North Korea will augment its command and control practices, recognize what nuclear weapons can and can't do for its national strategy. And I think it behooves, the intelligence community to sort of keep up with advances that North Korea is making, how North Korea is thinking about conflict, peace and conflict on the Korean Peninsula, and push ahead there. The final note I'll say, and the administration is already doing this, is coordinating and collaborating with allies. And here I think the picture gets particularly complicated because I think unlike at least any time in the last decade, the preferences that we see in Seoul and Tokyo for how to proceed with North Korea could not be more different. And I think that's going to be a particularly complicating factor for the ongoing policy review. I mean, if Tokyo gets a veto, certain things just aren't going to happen. On the flip side, if the administration decides to go with what Moon Jae-in wants, that's going to leave many people uncomfortable in Japan. So there will be this matter of squaring the circle with two allies that not only aren't getting along too well themselves, but just have a very different set of preferences right now on what matters on the Korean Peninsula. So I'll stop there.
You guys have been absolutely superb. I've learned a lot. I've so enjoyed this. I can't thank John Park enough for organizing this insightful panel, the reflections on your book and on this, this country that fascinates us and frustrates us all. So thank you to the Harvard Kennedy School. Thanks to John Park. Did you want to have a final word, John?
I did. Thank you so much. And Robin, I think your experience from reporting from 140 countries gave us a sense the ease with which your resilience with the technical difficulties. Thank you so much, Robin. And to our authors here, Anna, the great successor, Van, On the Brink, Ankit with Kim Jong-un and the bomb. I just want you to know that on campuses and in capitals, your book is having an impact and is a part of the conversation. And you've gotten us to a great start with this new tradition of bringing authors of new books for this particular panel and upcoming summits. For that, commend you. Thank you all for joining. And please join me a round of applause to our panel here. Virtual applause here. Thank you so much. We are going to break now. We're going to take a break until 5:50 p.m. East Coast time, and we'll start again with panel 2, looking at what's old and what's new with negotiating with a nuclear North Korea. Thank you all.
Thanks a lot, John.
Thank you.
Welcome to our second panel today, where we'll be examining what's new and what's old with negotiating with a nuclear North Korea. It's a very timely discussion as the Biden administration conducts its North Korea policy review. We have a stellar panel to explore these questions in more depth. Our moderator today is Dr. Francesca Giovannini, who is Executive Director of the Project on Managing the Atom. She'll be also introducing the speaker shortly. Dr. Giovannini previously served as Strategy and Policy Officer to the Executive Secretary of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization in Vienna. Prior to that, she was the Director of the Research Program on Global Security and International Affairs at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in Boston. Dr. Giovannini holds a doctorate from the University of Oxford. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Giovannini. I hand it over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you, John, and good evening, everyone. John, let me thank you first for this extraordinary event. The second annual Harvard Korean Security Summit sets a fantastic framework for much needed discussion on nuclear issues and beyond, and brings together speakers and attendees from 3 continents, I think this is an extraordinary achievement that speaks volume to you, of course, and to your team. So again, thank you so much for inviting me and for hosting this great event. As John said, we have an all-star panel, and I couldn't emphasize more the amount of knowledge and expertise that these speakers bring with us today. And so we are so very thankful for your time and your availability to share your unique experiences. As John said, this is a panel that talks about negotiating with the nuclear North Korea, what's old and what's new. And the premise of this panel is pretty simple, that while the significant advancements in North Koreans' weapons and ballistic missile capabilities are new, the challenges to negotiate with North Korea is not. And it's also clear that the sanctions that were designed to impede the progress of the North Korea nuclear weapon program have not been as effective as we had hoped to be. And despite the season of summits, North Korea continues to expand its nuclear weapons arsenal. So we hope our speakers today will be able to enlighten us on the path ahead, incentives, and what needs to be done to re-engage a much stronger nuclear weapon North Korea today. Let me begin by introducing the panelists one by one. Professor David Kang is professor in international relations, business, and East Asian languages and cultures at the University of Southern California, with appointments in both the School of International Relations and the Marshall School of Business. He's also the director of the Korean Studies Institute, and I have to say he has an infinite list of awarded books. But I want to mention, Professor, your latest one, which is American Grand Strategy and East Asian Security in the 21st Century. And again, welcome to the panel. Andrew Kim is a non-resident fellow with the Korea Project at the Kennedy School Belfer Center, and we welcome Andrew so much for joining the Belfer Center for this panel today. Mr. Kim retired in November 2018 as a senior intelligence officer from the Central Intelligence Agency after 28 years in service. His last position was assistant director of the CIA for the Korea Mission Center. He established the Korea Mission Center in April 2017 in direct response to the presidential initiative to defuse North Korea's long-standing threat to global security. And again, welcome. Dr. Gina Kim is a research fellow and chief of the North Korean Military Research Division at the Korea Institute for Defense Analysis. She's also an adjunct professor at Yonsei Graduate School of International Studies. Dr. Kim specializes in U.S.-North Korea relations and nuclear non-proliferation issues. She serves on the Advisory Committee for the Blue House National Security Office, the Advisory Committee for the U.S. ROK Combined Force Command, and the Policy Review Committee for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Dr. Kim, welcome. Dr. Gary Seymour is a senior fellow with the Korea Project. He is with us and he will remain with us hopefully for a long time. He's also director of the Crown Center for Middle East Studies and professor of the practice of politics at Brandeis University. Dr. Seymour was also formerly executive director for research at the Belfer Center. He served for 4 years as President Obama's White House coordinator for arms control and weapons of mass destruction, including as a US Sherpa for the 2010 Nuclear Security Summit in Washington, D.C., and the 2012 Nuclear Security Summit in Seoul, South Korea. Welcome, Gary. And finally, last but certainly not least, the Honorable Susan Thornton is a senior fellow at the Paul Tsai China Center at Yale University. In 2018, she retired from the State Department after 28 years diplomatic career, focused primarily on East and Central Asia. In leadership role in Washington, she worked on China and Korea policy, including stabilizing relations with Taiwan, the US-China Cyber Agreement, the Paris Climate Accord, and led a successful negotiation with Pyongyang for monitoring of the agreed framework on denuclearization. And again, very welcome to have you. All right, so let me begin with a question that I would like to pose to all the panelists, mostly to set the framework for our discussion. And my first question is the following. Now that the season of presidential summits has ended, what has changed for the better and what has instead changed for the worse? Professor Kang, let me begin with you.
Well, first, thanks for having me, Dr. Park, and the security study. It is a wonderful, wonderful conference. I'm delighted to be here. And I have far less experience than anyone else on this panel in actually negotiating. So perhaps what I can do is provide a little bit of overview to set the stage for those who have far more experience than me, which is, you know, the presidential summits by themselves in the sort of historical arc of things were interesting because we had never had summits, but also without the actual preparation for what we wanted to achieve and how we were going to do it. In many ways, even if you support diplomacy, these were unlikely to have a major impact because we weren't prepared to seize the opportunity, if you will. And so as I see us now back to normal negotiating, meaning we will have a lot more lower level interactions, what we're back to is the same kinds of questions that we've had for 20 or 30 years. Are the sanctions not working because they're not being pushed hard enough? Or are they fundamentally unlikely to get North Korea to change their ways? Is North Korea strong and able to survive? Or is it very weak and about to collapse? And these are the kinds of debates that we have had for 20 years or so. And I think that the Biden administration is going to have to grapple with where they come down on, is it just not enough pressure or do we need a fundamentally new approach? And how strong is North Korea? So I'll stop there for now.
Mr. Kim, how strong is North Korea and what has changed for the worse and for the better?
Okay, so also we really appreciate this opportunity to actually hear what other people have their views on North Korea and this very interesting topic, and really appreciate the Belfer Center to have this wonderful session. So if just me taking from the Professor Kang, what he said about, you know, kind of where now we're coming back to sort of where we were in terms of how we usually, you know, our practice of negotiating with North Korea in the working level through, you know, working up, because I guess the last administration, and I was part of that team that where we work sort of down, up to down kind of a system. And, you know, there's a definitely lesson learned from each of different type of negotiation styles. But what I can tell you based on my experience with the previous administration, it's going to be a very difficult for Biden administration to meet the expectation of what North Koreans now have after they had an experience meeting with, have a summit with the U.S. president. When that expectation is up, it will be difficult to kind of managing that expectation from this point on. So I think that will be a first challenge they're going to face. The other thing that if I can address a little bit on the difference between what we had before and what, you know, we're going to be facing in the future is that over the last 30 years, you know, starting 94 with the framework up to 6-party talks and up to the recent engagement with North Korea, we tried different styles, so many, you know, ways, and we all had a lesson learned from different kind of events. And I think we kind of cycled through a lot different, you know, type of negotiation, and I'm not sure at this point there will be kind of a very innovative way to deal with the North Korea and negotiation in the future. I think probably it will be a kind of a more wise to look at how we did it in many different terms, and then probably pick up what we know, how we did well in the before, and then probably mix some of those negotiation styles to moving forward at this point. So basically, what I'd like to summarize is that it's going to be a very challenging for Biden administration with dealing with the North Korea who have will have a high expectation based on their last experience. Let me stop there.
Thank you. Dr. Kim.
Yes, I'm very glad to be part of this meeting today. Thank you very much. Well, I think North Korea must have lessons learned. The US president alone can change how to negotiate with North Korea, but not what to negotiate or what to demand from North Korea. Pyongyang will understand that Washington will not accept any deal short of comprehensive disarmament of the WMD program, and also that the long-range missile program will always be an issue. Although the US approach under President Trump was different in terms of negotiation style, but FFVD is not at all different from CVID. At least we came to know what Chairman Kim wanted to offer on the table. Partial lifting of sanctions in exchange of phased implementation of denuclearization. At the midnight press conference, North Korean diplomats emphasized that the North asked for easing sectoral sanctions, not the entire sanctions measures, including strategic export control. So in my opinion, opening up of the Yongbyon facility and placing inspectors on the ground is not really a bad deal. The reason why we are reluctant to accept North Korea's offer is because of, distrust. We are concerned that North Korea can walk away anytime from talks and restart nuclear activities. But if we have no BOTNA, in other words, best alternative to the negotiated agreement, we have to figure out how to keep North Korea's long-term commitment and how to prevent cheating by increasing transparency, and how to increase our leverage by convincing North Korea of the benefits of a nuclear disarmament deal. What can change under the Biden administration is that North Korea cannot exclude South Korea from negotiations with the US. History shows that North Korea always wanted to have a direct talks with the US while weakening South Korea's position in the whole process and dealing with North Korea problem. But the Biden administration is supposed to keep close consultations with the allies, and South Korea's keeping close communications with the North is not bad at all. When Seoul has leverage on Pyongyang, then Washington can use it. What changed for the worse is that, in my opinion, North Korea became more cautious than before in the negotiation. Officials handling Pyongyang's relations with Washington have been demoted amid lack of progress in talks with the US. However, Kim Young-chul maintained his position in the political bureau within the party and is currently heading the United Front Department. Considering his background as a head of a delegation from the North to the Inter-Korean high-level military talks and director of the Reconnaissance General Bureau in the military, he will continue to represent a very conservative voice in Pyongyang. So that's my concern.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kim. Dr. Seymour.
Thank you, Francesca. It's great to see you and appear on this wonderful panel. So I think the situation is fundamentally unchanged. Kim Jong-un is not willing to give up his nuclear weapons and long-range missile program, at least over the next 4 years during Biden's first term. But Kim Jong-un might be willing to accept limits, such as extending the current moratorium on nuclear weapons and long-range missile testing, or even beginning to limit production of fissile material, starting with the Yongbyon facility, as Kim Jong-un proposed to Trump at the 2019 Hanoi summit. And I think it's at least possible that North Korea's economic difficulties because of COVID and sanctions and natural disasters might make Kim Jong-un a little bit more willing to accept limits on the program in exchange for sanctions relief and economic assistance, mainly from the ROK. So the only way to find out whether there's an opportunity here to negotiate limits is to actually engage in negotiations, mainly between the US and North Korea. And I hope the Biden administration, once they finish their policy review, I hope they appoint a special envoy for North Korea and offer to resume negotiations based on the Singapore Summit Declaration. And then we'll find out whether Kim Jong-un is willing to accept, and if so, whether those negotiations produce any positive result. But in any event, I wouldn't expect there to be really dramatic or quick progress. We know from experience in all of our previous negotiations with North Korea that the results are extremely difficult to achieve, takes a lot of difficult negotiations, and any agreement is of course subject to North Korean cheating or reneging, as they've done so often in the past.
Thank you. Ms. Jordan.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Francesca. It's great to see everyone again for this great event that John is putting on. Really honored to be here among so many Korean nuclear experts. I am not one of those, but I would like to echo what Gary said, which is I don't think many things have fundamentally changed. What I always look for on the Korea nuclear issue is kind of what can we learn. We've had now almost 30 years at this, and we should have learned a bunch of things. And I think those of us on this panel have probably learned them. Some of the people higher than us may not have learned them. So let me just go over what I think they are. I think we've learned that we can basically live with the status quo, which is not going to be a comfortable thing for many people to hear. Different people have different levels of comfort with the status quo. That's true. But if you look around at Japan, China, the U.S., the ROK and the Dprk, the main players, they've all shown that they can basically live with the status quo to varying degrees of comfort. Second, I think what we've learned is that the sanctions don't work. The sanctions were supposed to bring North Korea to its knees, was supposed to, make it easy to get a deal that we were going to work toward. And you can poke around on whether they're being implemented or not. But let's remember, under the Trump administration, we put on so many sanctions on the North Korean economy, and they have not come sort of begging with their tin cup. It's amazing, actually. I wish more people would talk about this. But that's a big thing that I learned, because I thought for sure when we put those last series of sanctions on, that was going to make a big difference. It really didn't make a big difference. And at that time, we had the Chinese working with us. So I think that's important to look at. I think another thing we've learned is that we cannot do this by ourselves. And Gina Kim, good to see you here, said rightly that we've got to get over this notion that we can do it unilaterally, the US. We've got to work with the South Korean government. The South Korean government ideally would generate a firmer consensus in South Korea around what they want to do. That's always been an issue, but I think working with them is absolutely necessary. And I take as a good sign the Biden conversation with President Moon recently, and I think we will do that. So that'll be a good step. But others in the region too need to be brought in a contact group or whatever, just to keep everybody on side so North Korea can't do their usual splitting and working the seams. I think we need to make up our mind that this is a long-term project. I think it was Gary that just said, 4 years is not going to be enough time to negotiate something with North Korea. And we've got to see that this is a long-term project. And I think it's also important that we see it as a problem that is going to be managed and not necessarily solved. So those are the things that, from my perch, which is probably not as close as some of the other people on the panel, I have learned, or at least think I've learned over the last period of time working on this issue.
Terrific. Thank you so much. I wanted to ask then a follow-up question to all the panelists, mostly about the capabilities that North Korea has developed, in fact, in most recent times, and not only, of course, nuclear weapons, but the missile program. I wanted to ask a little bit about whether you think these advancements have changed their bargaining position. For example, even the most latest statement by Kim Jong-un during the 88th Party Congress in January, announcing that they would increase, in fact, the nuclear arsenal. Does it actually matter at this point, or more capabilities will not necessarily change the bargaining dynamics? Can I start with you, Susan, and then I'll go in reverse?
Yeah, I mean, I am not an expert on North Korean weapons, but the thing that strikes me is that, you know, as their capabilities continue to grow, it makes the US more and more kind of exercised, and it creates leverage for the North Koreans, I think. So I would say that, you know, I mean, it's a difficult thing to deal with in the negotiations, because there are all kinds of other things that, you know, once we start talking to them, that enter into the picture from various angles, human rights and other things. But I think that definitely the elevation in capabilities, it does give them, I mean, as we've seen in previous negotiation, it gives them a bit more leverage. But I'll let others speak to this because I'm not as expert in this.
Thank you. Gary.
So I think North Korea, like any nuclear armed country, is worried about the risk of its nuclear forces being destroyed in a preemptive attack. So North Korea, like other nuclear countries, will try to develop technologies that give them a more survivable nuclear deterrent. That means moving from liquid fueled to solid fueled missiles, which are easier to move around and can be launched on much shorter notice. It means developing submarine launched missiles, which North Korea clearly is seeking to do. And it means developing more accurate missiles and missiles with penetration aids in order to overcome US missile defense. So I think all of the lines of North Korea's strategic nuclear development are exactly what we would expect from a nuclear country that fears a preemptive attack by the United States and its allies. Now, North Korea obviously has limited capability. They're not China, they're not Russia, so they can't proceed as quickly, or they can't amass as capable a force as those countries. But North Korea, I think, will continue to pursue nuclear and missile developments that will give them more confidence that their nuclear forces can survive a preemptive attack from the United States and the ROK and Japan.
And Gary, just a follow-up question. Do you think this will actually impact the bargaining position then and the strategy?
Well, North Korea is not going to give up its nuclear weapons in any event. So again, the best we can do is achieve limits. And you could argue, I mean, if you want to be an optimist, you could argue that at some point Kim Jong-un may calculate that he has a sufficient nuclear force to have a credible deterrent, and therefore he would be willing to accept a freeze on further development. Now, of course, that's a proposition that can only be tested in negotiation, but it's at least possible that North Korea may feel that a couple of dozen nuclear weapons with a reliable delivery capability is enough, and that would make it easier for him to accept limits on production of further nuclear weapons or further missile development.
Thank you. Gina.
Yes, my expectation is that North Koreans will believe that time is on their side. As announced at the Party Congress, North Korea never stopped development of its nuclear weapons program, although there has been self-imposed moratorium on testing. But production of fissile material, upgrading infrastructure, diversifying delivery means, import of banned and dual-use items from abroad, all of these contributed to the advancement of North Korea's weapons program. And North Korea keeps disclosing the existence of its advanced weapons program, advancing day by day. By doing so, North Korea can ask the US to make more negotiating room to avoid a worsening situation caused by no agreement. The North would like to wait and see without seeking a dramatic change by resuming dialogue anytime soon. It'll be in North Korea's interest to achieve assured destruction capabilities. Therefore, North Korea has focused on securing second strike capabilities, and it recently warned that it made a significant progress in the SLBM and submarine project at the Party Congress. That's the message to the US. A message to South Korea is that the North Koreans engage in a tit-for-tat rivalry with their counterpart in the South. Pyongyang has been preparing its nuclear force to undertake various operational missions. KN-23, 24, and 25 are all short-range weapons that can give North Korea a hedge against South Korea's modernized conventional forces. And it can be a challenge to South Korea's missile defense system. In the long run, it will also be in North Korea's interest to join any kind of arms reduction talk on an equal footing with others. I will be surprised if the US begins arms control negotiations with North Korea anytime soon. However, if North Korea begins talks with the South on structural arms control, which is limiting the number of weapon systems on both sides in the future, it'll be in North Korea's interest to prepare bargaining chips, as many as possible, for future trade-offs. So I think we are going to see similar patterns in the following months or years.
Terrific, thank you. Andrew.
Thank you. So I kind of agree with Dr. Gina Kim on many different points that she made. So going back to sort of lesson learned, I think we gotta have to be in Chairman Kim Jong-un's head. What did he learn from the last go around? I think they came in to negotiate with the Trump administration with their own mind that they had a lesson learned from way back in Clinton administration, where they thought year 2000 with Secretary of State then Albright visited North Korea. They thought they were almost there to have a normalized relationship with the United States. However, after the election year 2000, when President Bush came in, it became sort of went back to sort of a square zero. So they realized that with a different political system dealing with the United States, they don't have much time. They got to start talking to US administration very early on, to even with the thinking that they probably deal with that administration only 4 years, let's say, they got to accomplish what they want to accomplish within that time. I think that was their lesson learned. And then coming into Trump administration, they did exactly what they learned from that previous by reaching out to Trump administration very early on, hoping that they can start the negotiation very kind of with all these starts. Well, second lesson learned, that didn't work again, right? So what are they going to, from this point on, how are they going to deal with this? Which is, I think, with the recent development of or announcement of their intent to further develop their weapons and all that, is the kind of a way they want to pre-position themselves to negotiate with the United States. Hopefully that US will come to them and agree with action for action, which they wanted that so much for the last 4 years. Every time I went and sit down with North Korea, Kim Young-chul and everybody wanted to have that drill in our head, say action for action. We don't trust you. We hated each other for 70 years. How can we give up everything because you gave us a blank check or promise that you're gonna help us at the end, but how can we trust you? What you want us to do is to non-reversible action, but what you promise is that you can reverse anytime you want. So action for action is a very core issues that they want us to agree with. They're gonna put on table again, I believe, with the new administration in the United States. in order to, if they ever go into that path, they gotta have to have a more leverage for action, right? So that's why I believe they want to make sure that everybody understand that they have a more capability and they have a more intent to develop the weapon. So let me put it, stop there.
Thank you. Thank you so much. David.
Yeah, I mean, I can't add too much to what's already been said because I agree with almost all of it. The way that I think about it is this: it's fairly clear to me that in the run-up to 2016, 2017, Kim Jong-un signaled fairly clearly that instead of waiting at the bottom of the hill and trying to negotiate some kind of a nuclear deal or whatever else, they were going to march up the hill, nuclearize, and then offer to come back down the hill if we met some kind of, what they want, what they need. They were tired of doing the stop me before I do it. And they marched up the hill and we all saw what happened. That's where they are right now. And they may be willing to take a couple of steps back down, but they're not going to do it, again, just as Mr. Kim said, just because we sort of offer them some vague things. And so in that sense, I think Kim is in actually a very good position. Whereas 5 or 6 years ago, they didn't really have the kind of a nuclear force they have now. They've really gone for it. And now they'll say, we can move forward, we can take a step back, it's up to you. And I think that's where we are right now. And I don't think it's going to be very easy for us to simply bluster or make vague promises for them to do anything meaningful. And that's what's up to this administration.
Thank you. I have a follow-up question to all of you, and some of you have already started trying to address this question. So, Gary, you talked about, in agreement to achieve limits, and some other panelists have talked about denuclearization not being on the card really, but the status quo may be acceptable with some conditionalities. And so the question I have for you now is really talking about an age of arms control with North Korea. If we are now exiting this, prospect for denuclearization and we are entering into a phase of arms control, how do we structure an arms control negotiation with North Korea? Where do we start and how do we structure it? Gina, can I start with you? I think you have started sketching out some of the steps, and I think that would be a good start for us.
Right. Regarding arms control, actually, the two Koreas have discussed arms control and confidence building measures for 3 decades, since early 1990s. We have almost 10 major CBM agreements, including the last one in 2018. But we could never fully implement those agreements. The question is why? Because we could not solve the nuclear issues, which always have been an obstacle to build trust between the two Koreas. Without trust, we cannot move from operational to structural arms control. Therefore, arms control should be linked with denuclearization process anyway. South Korea will not support arms control without denuclearization. And as I understand, the US Congress will not accept anything short of complete denuclearization, nuclear disarmament in North Korea. At least at the track 1 level, we still support complete denuclearization. South Korea can continue perhaps discussing operational arms control, that is regulating the operations and associated readiness of forces such as training, exercising, and positioning. We haven't fully discussed, by the way, structural arms control, which limits the size and composition of the force structure. And besides, there is a tit for tat going on between the two Koreas, which is obviously not good for the regional stability. Indeed, the two Koreas agreed to discuss phased arms reduction in 2018, but at the time we said these can happen in accordance with sufficient confidence building measures. Another problem is in the post-denuclearization era, perhaps North Korea's reliance on other types of conventional weapons will certainly increase rather than decrease. Building arms can help North Korea offset any change of the military balance after giving up nuclear capabilities. This makes it really hard for the two Koreas to discuss structural arms control. Plus, South Korea's weapons acquisition, such as reconnaissance and surveillance assets, destroyers, fighter jets, such as F-35, is part of South Korea's defense reform and transfer of operational control from the U.S. These are necessary conditions that South Korea should acquire. It becomes an alliance issue, not an inter-Korean issue. And all these alliance issues should go through close consultations between the two allies. This is not easy and will take a lot of time. So in the near future, can we talk about structural arms control? I'm not sure about that.
Thank you. Excellent point. Gary.
So I agree with Jenna Kim that it's very important for the U.S. to continue to maintain the ultimate objective of denuclearization, even though that won't take place for many years, if only to relieve pressure on South Korea and Japan to produce their own nuclear weapons, which of course they're both technically capable of doing. So in terms of interim steps toward denuclearization, I think the most important immediate objective for the Biden administration is to prolong the test moratorium, because the test moratorium has not only had the effect of imposing some technical limits on North Korean development of nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles, but also it served to reduce tensions on the Korean Peninsula and the risk of conflict. So I think the first focus is on extending the test moratorium. And then secondly, I think it's worth at least trying to achieve limits on production of fissile material, because that's the most effective way to limit the number of nuclear weapons that North Korea has in its arsenal. And we know Kim Jong-un was prepared to, or offered to, shut down and dismantle Yongbyon in his meeting with Trump in Hanoi. Now, dismantling Yongbyon by itself doesn't solve the problem, because North Korea has additional facilities to produce fissile material, but it could be the start of a process that would eventually lead to shutting down and dismantling additional, or those other facilities to produce fissile material. What does North Korea want in return? I think they mainly want economic benefits. That's partly would take the form of sanctions relief, but I think a lot of it has to take the form of economic cooperation and assistance. And that's where South Korea really has a dominant position in terms of willingness for private business to be engaged in investment and trade, infrastructure development in North Korea. China also has a role, but I think South Korea is probably the most critical. And then finally, I just want to mention that the difficulty in arms control is verification. I mean, North Korea poses one of the most difficult challenges in terms of verification, because so far they haven't even been willing to acknowledge all of their secret nuclear facilities, much less allow international monitoring and inspection that would be necessary to verify that those facilities are shut down or they've been dismantled. And the idea of verifying North Korean number of nuclear weapons or their ballistic missile inventory, I mean, this is so far beyond what has been politically possible that I think we have to recognize there are real limits to this arms control process unless North Korea fundamentally changes its attitude toward international verification.
Thank you, Gary. Let me go to Susan.
I was listening to Gina and Gary, and I want to say basically, yeah, what they said. I think, keeping denuclearization as the ultimate objective is absolutely essential, for many reasons. Starting with the continuation of the moratorium on exercises, I think is probably obvious, because that's how we've gotten to this very uneasy status quo that we're in now. And then I think the sort of trying to reduce production of fissile material, going after Yongbyon, that all makes perfect sense. I think, it's going to be a difficult discussion. The arms control piece, I mean, I've listened to a lot of people talk about, we need to get rid of denuclearization because they're never going to give up their nuclear weapons, and we need to turn to threat reduction. But I just don't understand what the North Korean motivation would be in that case. I'm not sure that they are going to be, I'm not really understanding why they would basically participate in that, unless it's for some kind of economic benefits. But then you have the same verification problems, as Gary said, that you do with the nuclear program. So I think the picture seems to me to be pretty clear as to what we should be trying to do. But the question is, will the politics allow for it? And I think, the politics are in Pyongyang and in Washington, probably.
Thank you. Andrew, it seems to me Susan is bringing up a very important point, right? The shift between arms control to threat reduction and the incentives that Dprk would have in one or the other cases. I mean, what were your discussions in North Korea? How can arms control process be structured realistically, based on your information?
So arms control basically means, are we ready to recognize North Korea as a nuclear power? Because when we start going into arms control or arms reduction discussion, that means indirectly or directly we're recognize them as a nuclear power, right? So I think that's where the problem is hung up, right? So let me clarify the whole kind of steps. So North Korean, with very beginning of our negotiation in 2018, they promised, and which they did, they put the moratorium on their nuclear weapon development and the testing of missiles, ICBM, which they did. And then what next step should be is fissile material reductions and all that, which is they throw the Yongbyon as the part of the bargaining for them. And I think there's a little misunderstanding or misinformation out there that when Kim Jong-un mentioned about Yongbyon, it was a Singapore summit. I was there when he raised that. Says he asked President Trump directly, say, if I get rid of Yongbyon, would you get rid of all the sanctions? That was the first time he raised that. It's not on the public, but I'm sure that with you. So that discussion started from the Singapore. President Trump rightfully said that's not enough, right? You got to do more. So anyway, so he put the moratorium, and then he started talking about the Yongbyon, get rid of Yongbyon. And I think Gary mentioned, and everybody agree, that the fortification is always the stumbling block in any of the negotiation with North Korea. Same thing. When we ask North Korea that we would like to send some of our technicians to do inspection, when they promise that they're going to get rid of the engine testing site in Dongchangni and all that, they were absolutely don't want to do that. They didn't want to do that, but then they finally agree, say, okay, maybe we'll entertain that idea, but you cannot bring any IAEA inspectors. There's something about them just don't want anybody else, right? And we said, no, it's not going to be just American. It's going to be international community, right? And so we could not go inch beyond that conversation because they absolutely didn't want it. So again, verification, very beginning conversation was stopped. So I think it will be very advantage for this new administration in the United States. We'll take it from there. I know that there's some political difference, and there's some reason for the new administration to start all over or doing something different than what happened in the last 3 or 4 years. But I think there's an advantage for this administration to take it from where it left because you can save a lot of time, right? So that's just my opinion here. Thank you.
Thank you. David.
Yeah, no, I think this is really insightful. And the only thing I would add, which I think is a important stumbling block, is Mr. Kim said, if we're going to talk about arms control, we're actually going to deal with North Korea. We have to admit the elephant in the room or whatever, that they actually are a nuclear power. We refuse to admit it, but that's the case, right? And I would actually say, I think in some ways a longer effort or a more enduring effort towards any kind of actual negotiation or arms control with North Korea requires something else, which is fundamentally almost impossible for us to do, which is to realize that North Korea is a real country with real people. Like, we know South Korea is a real country. It's got a real government. It has people, right? We don't tend to think of North Korea as an actual country. But if we're going to do something about it, we're going to have to actually recognize that and be prepared to live with a North Korea, nuclear or non-nuclear. And that is a massive transition from the expectation that once we get to nuclear weapons, somehow everything will be done and it will just sort of disappear. It's probably a little more realistic to say, we've lived with this country for almost 70 years. We've probably got to live with it a bit longer. But that is really hard to do, both, I think, conceptually and politically.
David, I want to have a follow-up question for you. When you say we just don't consider them a real country and real people, given your studies, your scholarship, the time you spend in East Asia, what drives you to say this?
Well, what I mean is that it's easy for us to see that South Korea is a legitimate existing country, but we tend to hold to, and this happens a lot. You go to briefings, you talk to people, it's like, it's not a country, it's one dictator and 25 million slaves, and it's going to collapse and blah, 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 blah. It's very conceptually hard for us to realize there's a country there. People, probably like in many countries, like some things about their country and don't like some things about their country as well. And I think conceptually as well, one of the reasons much of what we expect to happen doesn't is because we don't take it as a real country. So we keep expecting it's going to fall apart, or the sanctions are going to work and they'll all come caving down. And we realize that it's not, it is way more stable as a country than we think. One small point about that. I haven't done this, but I would encourage any grad student who's listening, go to the Foreign Policy Failed States Index that they've been doing for 15 or 20 years. I suspect North Korea is always at the bottom of that list, but it's still around and it's still thumbing its nose at the United States. And I think that conceptualization makes it hard for us to say, we may have to live with this country for a while. It's probably not going to go away.
Thank you. Now, before we take numerous questions from the audience that I'm already seeing, I want to ask one last question, if I can, and that involves China. We all know that previous US administrations have pressured China to turn the pressure on North Korea to come to the negotiating table. So I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about how you have seen this being played out, and how will this play out in the future? Will China accept pressure to put pressure on North Korea to come to the table, and if so, at what cost? Let me start with Gary.
Well, Ambassador Thornton is really the expert on this, but I don't expect much from China. I mean, it's true that the US and China share an interest in avoiding conflict on the Korean Peninsula. So I think in principle, there's a common interest in negotiating. I think the Chinese have decided a long time ago that denuclearization is no longer a practical objective. And as Susan said, the Chinese are prepared to live with the current situation. I think the interesting question is whether the overall context of US-China relations has made it even more difficult for the US and China to cooperate. But in my experience, the Chinese may occasionally get angry at North Korea and support sanctions when North Korea is testing ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons. Certainly, they were willing to support very strong UN Security Council sanctions. But when North Korea is behaving itself, I think the Chinese attitude on sanctions becomes pretty, they don't really enforce the sanctions very seriously, and I doubt we can expect China to support the kind of pressure that might actually raise questions about stability or survival of North Korea.
Susan.
Yeah, I've spent a lot of time on this, and I think basically that maximum pressure is over. So whether you are happy about that or sad about that, I think that's the reality. And because to have maximum pressure, you need not just China, you need a lot of other players in the world, but you definitely need China. And we did have maximum pressure at one point, and then we kind of lost it. And I don't think we're ever going to get it back, because there was a period when the Chinese had pretty poor relations actually with North Korea and with Kim Jong-un. There was quite a period there that coincided with a lot of the fire and fury time period, and we were able to use that to get the sanctions put in place. And then the Chinese actually did a lot of work to try to implement them. But I don't think we're going to be back there, both because the North Korea-China relationship has improved. And of course, as Gary mentions, the U.S.-China relationship has really gone downhill. And I think, we shouldn't be too pessimistic about it. I mean, the Chinese are happy with the status quo as long as it's like stable, and there's a more or less stable North Korea that's not going to create problems for them if they don't have a nuclear test, and if they're not collapsing and sending refugees to China, and if China can trade with them, I think they can live with that. They'd probably be happy to see a better, more developed North Korea, more stable North Korea, but they probably don't think they can get that. And so, they can live with the status quo. What they're not going to be happy about is if we try to engineer something around, behind their back, then you could see where they could work to not throw a spanner in the works, but certainly to be not helpful and possibly even, a little bit undermining whatever we're trying to do. So, I mean, that's why I would support some kind of contact group, not that relies too much on them for help, but at least keeps them feeling like they're participating, so they don't, get coming in the back door or something. But that would be what I would expect in the near term. If we see some kind of unexpected improvement in U.S.-China relations, maybe they could be convinced to do something productive in the way of whatever project or whatever negotiation we set up. But I think for now, certainly it's not probably a realistic place to call a prospective for cooperation between the two.
And Susan, a follow-up question. Do you ever see China taking the lead, like in a six-party talk? Is it feasible in the future that China will decide to actually have even a bigger leading role in this, or is out of the question?
I would be skeptical of China taking a leading role. What I've seen them do is be a pretty proactive intermediary between parties that were not on the same page in a negotiation, to try to get to a goal in the six-party process in particular, where they were sort of the hosts, and that's how they saw their job. But I can't really see them. They think that this is, this is a U.S. kind of centered problem. And so they probably wouldn't think that they would be able to solve it, even if they wanted to take a leading role and do something about it.
Thank you. David.
Yeah, I'm going to make a slight, I agree with everything you said. I don't think China has any interest in really, pushing forward. I'm going to make one point more about South Korea in this case, which is just that we often sort of view countries in the region potentially as having to take sides between US and China. I'm not sure how much of the DC blob? How much of the DC policymaking establishment has gone that way towards the China threat? But we want to cause countries to choose us, not China. And sometimes we get mad at them when they don't. We often view US as the provider of security and China as a potential economic partner of these countries in East Asia. And the reason that South Korea is never going to make that choice is that China is not just an economic partner of South Korea, it's central to its security, as we're finding. No matter what, we want a solution on the Korean Peninsula, the Chinese have to be on board. As Ms. Thornton pointed out, maximum pressure is over if they're not involved. And the South Koreans know that. And so I don't see China taking a very forward-leaning role on this. I think they are done with the American pressure. But no matter what, the South Koreans have to navigate that relationship. And I think they see great value in it. It's not simply that they have to. They have to have good relations with China, and in order to manage their security relationship. And that's how I see this sort of playing out.
Thank you. Andrew.
So my point of I guess, experience dealing with both China on this issues, I learned from my own experience that I think we have folks in the US government in the past that the pressuring China will eventually work, pressuring North Korea will eventually work. I always kind of thought that will not work because despite what sometimes people think that China may feel that the North Korea is their liability, but I believe that China thinks the United States is the biggest liability for them. So I don't think for the interest of national security and whatever, I don't believe that China is going to be ever work with the US in a full, honest manner to solve the North Korea. And also, as Susan mentioned about the China possibility leading role as, kind of a six-party talk format, I don't think it really matters what China think, what kind of role they can play. As long, I believe that if North Korea doesn't recognize China as the leading role on their own North Korean issues, I don't think it's going to work. And I believe North Korea will not going to agree to any China taking any leading role for resolving their own North Korea issues at all. So I think, having some kind of expectation what the China would do for, helping solving this issue is probably, we should not have that. The other thing is about the maximum pressure. I agree with all the comments people made about it's over, and I know there's some point during the whole campaign that China and Russia kind of agreed with our proposal and the UN sanctions, and I was actually amazed to watch that they actually did, because I thought it's going to be always challenging to convince them in the UN format to agree with us. I think the sanction itself, and I think someone mentioned very early on in the session that we put so many sanctions in China, and I think Susan mentioned that didn't work, and I agree. We put sanctions against North Korea over the years, of so many different sanctions over the years. The reason it didn't work is that, I'm going to be a little bit harsh on this, but if you're trying to tell someone who doesn't have anything, say that we're not going to give you any more, or you cannot have any more, it doesn't really affecting them, right? So the sanction that we've been putting on to North Korea is against North Korea as a country. I think maximum pressure worked a little bit in the beginning because we kind of focus on certain sectors, and we focus on certain privileged class people who believe that they have something in their position. And when you're trying to take certain thing away from those people, they're the one who feel most hurt. And I think that was the kind of a way we designed. For instance, North Korea, the people send their people out to workers out to overseas making money. All the money goes into certain, back channel to North Korea government. But when North Korea wants to go working overseas, they have to bribe somebody to get that job. And when we put on the sanction to send those workers back to North Korea, who actually get most hurt is the people who are taking this kickbacks, right? Because those income is drying now, right? So I think if we design in a sanction that will target a certain sectors and certain class of people in North Korea, it will work. But I think what happened up to this point was that we just sanctioned the whole economy, and that's what didn't work. So let me stop there.
Fantastic, thank you. Gina.
Yes, thank you. In my opinion, China's leverage on the Dprk is very significant, but we should not overestimate it. For the time being, North Korea seeks strategic alliance with China, but heavy reliance on China is not at all desirable. And it certainly contradicts with North Korea's political philosophy, 주체, self-reliance and self-sufficiency. As we all agree, China prefers regional stability. When it has to focus on especially responding to Washington's tough policy, it is likely to prefer stability in North Korea. That means that it will not push North Korea hard enough to cause regime instability. China will support multilateral cooperation as long as such form of interaction does not target a specific country, though. But China will also knows living with a nuclear armed North Korea is not desirable. There are areas of competition and areas of cooperation between the US and China. And I believe denuclearization is one of the issues that the US and China can cooperate. China's interest is directly challenged by nuclear proliferation and nuclear safety issues that may be caused by the nuclear program in North Korea. China's interest is joining a dialogue on peace treaty, by the way, which can change US military posture in this region one way or another. In order to be there, that kind of stage, China should support denuclearization. And for the purpose of slowing down the pace of North Korea's weapons proliferation, I think China's role is crucial because, well, it is responsible for the export of dual-use items to North Korea. This is happening not just because Beijing condones it, but because probably North Korea is very good at getting around of international monitoring. By creating and closing down shell companies, disguising activities, and hiding traces behind, North Korea is challenging the existing non-proliferation export regime. If North Korea expects that the UN Security Council will be divided on taking additional measures to pressure North Korea, then it will be emboldened to attempt military actions. It is also important in that regard to get China on board in sending a unified message that anything that can destabilize the regional peace can be met by strong actions by the UN. My final thought on the sanctions is regarding sanctions, at least on strategic export seem to work, although still there is a loophole in the sanctions regime. The trade volumes significantly dropped in 2018 and 2019, which made a few countries major exporters of goods that can be used for the WMD program in North Korea. Indeed, China is the #1 exporter of controlled and dual-use items to North Korea. If increasing China's national capability to control all different kinds of transactions is the problem, then we have to work on that in cooperation.
Thank you very much to the panelists for this extraordinary amount of knowledge and expertise you have all been willing to share, I want to turn now to some of the questions that have flooded my chat. So clearly that is a show that you have all touched upon very, very important issues that our attendees want to know more about. I want to pick on one comment that Eric has made on the chat. He said that many of you have said the Dprk will come to the table when it is ready and from a position of strength. Some also have said the Dprk has learned that he has to start early given the 4-year US presidential terms. Do you think that the Biden administration is starting from a mistaken assumption when we hear statements that it will use sanctions to force the Dprk back to the negotiating table? Maybe Dprk is already ready to come to the table. Who wants to take this question? Gary.
So, you know, the Biden administration is still in the process of doing their policy review. So they don't have a clear approach yet toward North Korea. But the people that are in the administration working on Asia, whether it's Kurt Campbell at the National Security Council or Sung Kim or Jin Park at the State Department, they're very experienced. And some of them, of course, have been directly engaged in nuclear negotiations with North Korea over many years. So I don't think they have any illusions about the prospects for achieving denuclearization. In reality, although, of course, as I said, the US will continue to say that that's our long-term objective. So I really, and I also think the Biden administration has an overriding interest in keeping things on the Korean Peninsula quiet, because Biden is focused so much on domestic problems, dealing with COVID and the economy and social justice issues. And even in foreign policy, North Korea is not very high on the agenda compared to China, or trying to recover the nuclear deal with Iran. So I think there's a very strong, overwhelming interest on the part of the Biden administration in offering to negotiate with North Korea. And the big question is whether Kim Jong-un accepts. I mean, we know after the failure of the Hanoi summit, the Trump administration tried over and over again under Steve Biegun to start negotiations among high-level officials and experts to try to negotiate an agreement. And Pyongyang was not interested. So to me, and I can't predict what Kim Jong-un will do, but the problem in negotiations is not in Washington, it's in Pyongyang. And the only point I made is that given North Korea's economic difficulties with COVID, because of COVID and sanctions and natural disasters, Kim Jong-un might be a little bit more disposed towards seeking negotiations in order to get sanctions relief and economic assistance. And the way to test that proposition is to offer to negotiate and find out whether North Korea accepts, and if so, whether it's possible to come to an agreement on some limited measures.
Gina.
Yes, regarding North Korea's position on talks, my takeaway from the 8th Party Congress in January is that, well, North Korea values talks with the US. Between Singapore and Hanoi, Secretary Pompeo mentioned that North Korea makes it clear that it has commitment in denuclearization. And people in the Blue House National Security Office who had conversations with the leadership in Pyongyang also believe that there's still a chance. Now we are in 2021. Will North Korea change their minds? Not sure yet, but one thing is sure. At the Congress, North Korea did not mention the possibility of a dialogue, but it said that North Korea could demonstrate its dignity and status in the world by holding a summit and declaring the establishment of new relations between North Korea and the US. It described the summit as a monumental achievement in the history of world politics. That's what they said. Besides, North Korea views the US as the primary obstacle to the development of the socialistic country. In other words, North Korea knows that it cannot complete the construction of socialism without solving the problems between North Korea and the US. And North Korea sent out very carefully calculated message at this time. It toned down its rhetoric a little bit compared to the past. And the Biden administration can try to see if North Korea is still interested in denuclearization talks. Well, obviously, North Korea's new policy introduced this year is people first policy. That means that North Korea should seek an exit for the improvement of its economy.
Thank you. I want to connect to this with a question about revenue generating activities. Andrew, I'm looking at you, but I think others like Susan will probably be asked next to address this question. A couple of our attendees have asked how important to North Korea's nuclear program is illicit revenue generation, such as through cybercrime and smuggling.
So can you repeat? Sorry, can you repeat the last?
Yes. How important North Korea nuclear program is illicit revenue generation from cybercrime and smuggling?
So we've seen in even just the open source that there was a lot of cyber activity, illegal cyber activities by the North Korea, and we saw even some huge revenue generated operations they had over the years. However, we haven't seen, maybe now different, but at least when I was in government, we haven't seen any specific per se evidence that the money or that they illegally collected through those kind of activities went into their nuclear or missile development program. We assume because of such a large amount of funding requires to build their missile, that we assume that some of those money that they elicit are going into that program. But do we have a specific evidence? I cannot pinpoint that at all.
Thank you. Susan, you have been involved in negotiating U.S.-China cyber agreements. What is your view about how cybercrime plays into North Korea nuclear ambitions? And is there something that we are in a position of doing on this?
Well, the cyber agreement between the U.S. and China had to do with not using state assets to steal commercial secrets for commercial gain. So that's not exactly the same thing that has been, at issue with North Korea. I mean, it's basically just straight out hacking and cybercrime on behalf of the state coffers, not to increase competitiveness of a private sector company or a company. So I think, obviously, there's so little that we know actually about what goes on inside North Korea, how they fund things, where they get their money, how their economy can possibly still be working, et cetera. And, somebody has made the point that, the North Koreans themselves closed the border because of COVID. So even though China was their lifeline, they cut their own lifeline in order to shut down the country for COVID to keep transmission of the pandemic from coming in. So, they are not without ability to survive privation, let's put it that way. So if they can gain resources through, these criminal activities, certainly smuggling goes way back in the case of North Korea. And as I think Gina mentioned, they're quite expert at hiding and evading and disguising, subterfuge, that kind of thing. So I think all of these funds are going to probably be important in some way for keeping the country going, including the military. And I think, keeping the military going back in the 90s when we had the famine going on was quite a major undertaking for the state, and it probably still is. So I think we have to look at trying to stop these things, but I don't think there's going to be an agreement that's going to do it. You're just going to have to keep working on countering hacking.
Yeah, I want to go back actually to what Will Toby said, and you just mentioned it, Susan. Will Toby in a chat commented that North Koreans themselves created maximum pressure with their post-COVID restriction, which effectively closed the border. So the question is, if that did not change policy, it is hard to see how mere sanctions will. Do the panelists agree? Susan, let's start with you since you have the floor and see.
I mean, I feel like we've been testing this proposition on sanctions with North Korea for the last 30 years, and we've ratcheted up. We've tried targeting luxury good items that would be important to the elites. We've tried cutting, every source of energy. We've tried cutting seafood and food products. And they went through the famine in the 90s. I just really have been amazed at the way that they have been able to adjust and adapt. And I just think it's really not going to, be in the cards that somehow sanctions are going to bring them to their knees. Now, maybe putting on additional sanctions gives you more cards to play in a negotiating game. As they build up weapon systems, we build up layers of sanctions, and then we can sort of reciprocally take them off each slice. But it's as far as having, bringing down the regime or increasing their motivation to come to the negotiating table, it just hasn't worked that way.
Yeah. David.
Yeah, no, I mean, I would basically agree with that. It's at the risk of being a little flippant, we say pressure hasn't worked. What should we do? More pressure. And again, if they lived through the famine in the 90s, they can survive this stuff. It's very clear, right? That's not the way. Someone I saw in the question and answer, and I'll sort of move over to that, like, what would it be like to deal with North Korea as a real country? Means realizing that we have to live with them. North Korea is not a problem to be solved. It's not like we're going to do some combination of sanctions and pressure and then problems are just going to disappear. They're going to be here. So much of the stuff that we say over and over again, we can't negotiate with them. We can't have diplomatic relations with them. That gives them what they want. We still refuse to treat them as a country. And in many ways, we are going to have to live with them. And so this is the type of stuff. They crave recognition, et cetera. It's a country that we are having problems treating as a real country. And I think we're going to have to live with North Korea no matter what for the foreseeable future. That's not a comfortable.
There's a specific follow-up question for you in the chat that says, to Dr. Kang's comments earlier, how might then the US and others go about treating North Korea as a real state? How would this look like?
Very simply, what I would say is something like, we actually realize we have to have diplomatic relations. And I always use the Soviet Union as the example. We really didn't like the Soviet Union, but we had relations with them when we talked with them precisely to keep the issues under control and figure out how to manage it. That we refuse to do that with North Korea, I think, is a major failing on the part of a sort of general American approach to North Korea. I think we'd be better off if we were consistently talking more often.
I want to Gary. Yep.
So I just want, I agree with David that establishing diplomatic relations would be a useful thing to do. I just want to point out the last time we tried that, it was North Korea that balked. After the 1994 agreed framework, that included a provision to establish liaison offices. And at the end of the day, the North Koreans were not willing to allow the US to have a liaison office in Pyongyang with the free use of the diplomatic pouch. So I think we should offer it. I think it's an important thing to establish, and maybe Kim Jong-un, unlike his father, is more willing to have some Americans living in Pyongyang. But so far, the main obstacle to actually executing that agreement has been North Korea, not Washington.
I have two more follow-up questions, but I want to go to Gina 1 second to ask you a question about sanctions. What is the view from South Korea of why sanctions have not worked as we expected?
Well, because of lots of loopholes in sanctions regime. And North Korea relies on its neighbors, Russia and China, especially China. And we talked about the COVID-19 impact on North Korea's society. Well, last year in 2020, the trade between North Korea and China dropped by 80%, almost 80%. That means a lot because of the self-imposed sanctions restrictions decided by the leadership in dealing with the COVID situation. But that caused some price change in the market, and major markets were closed because there are not many to sell because they cannot import any goods from China. And in the long run, it will affect North Korea's economy, which heavily rely on service sector and manufacturing sector. So I think in the long run, economic challenge is of great concern for the leadership in Pyongyang. And for example, participants to the party congress returned home without any gift, which was very unusual. It creates a lot of problems with the system to manage its leader elite relations. And if North Korea chooses, by the way, modeling through the situation, it can do so, but well, clock is ticking, actually.
Thank you. I want to close with two big framing questions, and I consider them extremely important. One asks, what would be the implications of recognizing North Korea as a nuclear arms state? How would that affect international non-proliferation efforts? Who wants to take a first stab at this? Gary, I'm going to call on you.
All right. So I think the first thing to recognize is that the word recognition has two different meanings in the English language. Of course, we know that North Korea has nuclear weapons. They've had nuclear weapons for at least 15 years. So we recognize that North Korea has nuclear weapons, and everybody in the US government knows that. But another meaning of recognition is to accept North Korea as a nuclear weapons state, which means that we give up on the long-term objective of achieving disarmament. And I think that would be a grave mistake. I think it would put political pressure on South Korea and Japan to reconsider their own nuclear position. And we know in South Korea in particular, there are a number of politicians and ordinary people who think South Korea should have nuclear weapons in order to balance the North, and because they can't really rely on the United States to defend them. So my concern is that if we do anything that shows that we've given up on the long-term objective of nuclear disarmament, and we accept or recognize North Korea as a nuclear weapons state, I'm very concerned that that would increase the likelihood that South Korea and then Japan would also develop nuclear weapons, which I think would really fundamentally change the security architecture of East Asia.
I take volunteers in the order in which you want to speak. I think this is a really important question. Andrew.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Gary about the recognition of North Korea will cause regional issues in the Northeast Asia. Also, once we start having that expectation to negotiate with North Korea, that will be the baseline. I think the U.S. is going to have a tremendous problem with the dealing with the North Koreas in the future. That's why I'm going back to, although it was very kind of a general terms, the agreement at the Singapore, at least Kim Jong-un came out in saying that he has intent to denuclearize. Okay, if we can pick it up from there, yes, it's a very general terms, and we had no specific timeline, how to go about to doing it. Yeah, there was no such a kind of detailed plans. But since he made that promise, or he made that statement, we can start from there. And then if we start from that point, then we don't really need to go into arms reductions or arms control conversation, right? So that's sort of my point.
Yeah, I would say that you don't need to do that in order to make, in order to have a very fruitful, theoretically at least, a very fruitful conversation and progression in the entire kind of relationships among Northeast Asian players, South and North Korea, the US and North Korea, possibly Japan and North Korea. You can get a lot done. You don't have to give recognition and acceptance of this state of affairs. And I think also it's just would be sort of politically untenable also in the US realistically speaking, to walk away from that.
Yeah. Could I then finish with one last question? Two of our attendees have asked what preconditions should the US attach to the resumption of future negotiations? Should the US continue to spearhead negotiations itself, to take a more multilateral approach? And if so, which countries should play the role of key partners? Let me go to David and then ask all of you maybe for some closing remarks on that.
Yeah, I will only point out one thing, which almost everybody here has better knowledge than me. And the question for preconditions, right, would be, who actually went big in Singapore? Vietnam, in Hanoi, right? My understanding was that there was a small deal that was being negotiated on both sides that would be the precursor to going bigger. And that somebody decided to go for it all and the other side walked away. I have heard conflicting arguments about who said, do everything now or we walk. If it was the US that went big, it's on us to figure out a way to go back to going small first. If it's on North Korea, then the preconditions for moving forward are actually going small. But I honestly do not have any of the inside information that almost all of you do. But to me, that's the real question of where we start.
Andrew, you already gave some of the answer, but it'll be interesting to see what are the preconditions, and should the US delegate to other countries part of this negotiations?
So I know it's going to be very challenging for this coming administration, as well as when we face this issue with North Korea. Because first of all, I think everybody understands this. Dealing with the North Korea, especially, I think Gary also has a tremendous experience dealing with them, is communicating with them in a very nuanced based, kind of style with the North Korea. It takes a long time to really filter through what they really want, right? So there's going to be a time-consuming process dealing with the North Korea. Precondition in this, in order to avoid that kind of a process, I think precondition will be I would like to see this administration pick it up from where it left in Singapore. And then, and I think Professor Kang mentioned about this, what really happened in Vietnam and all that. The reason I earlier mentioned about this whole Yanbian on the table, not as a formally, but informally by Kim Jong-un at the Singapore, was the kind of significant step. Then, a year later, they show up in Hanoi, and they haven't added anything. I think that was the big kind of problem, because after we said in Singapore, even in formal conversation, we said Yanbian is not enough. You got to do more, right? We gave them a message. And then a year later, they came to Vietnam, Hanoi, and they haven't changed anything. They keep put that only Yanbian on the table. That was why we walked away, right? There's no really progress on their side. Well, I guess it's so, our side was waiting for that additional things that we expecting them to put on the table. So my point is, the whole year was kind of spent the time in order for this new administration to reduce such time. I think it would be best if they can pick it up from Hanoi and saying, okay, this is what the base agreement. Can we take it from here and move forward? If you want action for action, let's talk about that. How can we do this, right? What will be important for you first, and then what will be important for us? I think that will be a kind of way to start, and I think it will reduce a lot of kind of time upfront. That's it.
Yeah, I agree that the precondition should be that both sides recommit to the Singapore summit declaration. I mean, the thing you have to understand is the North Koreans are always in the driver's seat. They're always in control, and they're more patient than we are. And if we, if we end up trying to chase them, then we won't get the result we want. So even though nobody likes strategic patience, and people say, oh, they're just going to keep building their weapons program, I think you can sort of say, recommit to Singapore, and then we're going to sit down and, have a discussion based on that, but don't chase them. I mean, they may make it difficult for us to be patient too. They have quite a lot of practice at that, but I think, they're in the driver's seat, and you have to recognize that and just wait until they're ready.
Thank you. Gina, are they in the driving seat, and shall we recommit from Singapore?
I think I agree with Susan Thornton. North Korea will say they already have done for talks moratorium testing, that it will ask the U.S. to do corresponding measures. Without struggling with additional preconditions, we can start talks to discuss step-by-step approach, starting from preventing the future nuclear armament, and then moving on to destroying existing nuclear stockpile. There should be a tailored roadmap for this that both the U.S. and North Korea can agree with. And doing so, we have to understand condition-based sanctions lifting should be one of the things that we should work on. And for doing so, we can work on subdividing lots of actions to be met, and then watch whether or not North Korea is meeting the requirement and give some rewards afterwards.
Terrific. Gary, you have the last word.
So, well, I agree with the other panelists. I think the Biden administration should offer to resume nuclear negotiations on the basis of the Singapore summit without precondition. And I hope they appoint a senior special envoy for North Korea, just as Steve Biegun was in the Trump administration. But I will say this, if North Korea resumes testing, if North Korea breaks the moratorium, then I think it's going to be very difficult politically for the Biden administration to engage in any negotiations. Instead, the automatic reaction will be more sanctions. So again, I think it's really up to Kim Jong-un whether he wants to have a nuclear negotiation or not.
So on behalf of the Korea Project, I want to thank you immensely for having spent 1.5 hours with us debating a very difficult and complex, wicked problem as we would define it. What I think is really incredible is, in spite of the enduring crisis and the ups and downs of negotiations, we have a very vibrant community of scholars and experts like yourself who continue to engage in this issue. That speaks volume, in my view. Many would have already, given up and thought this is an intractable problem that has no solution. And I think this is incredible to see the commitment you have towards this issue, towards the country, and towards global peace and security. So I really, really want to thank you. This has been a terrific panel. John, over to you, and thank you again for offering me this opportunity to moderate.
Well, thank you. And thank you to our panelists. It was a rich discussion with a lot of nuances on this enduring challenge of how to negotiate with a nuclear North Korea. My thanks again to all the panelists. We'll now move to the wrap-up session for day 2. Today's panel speakers provided great insights looking at North Korea and the North Korean leader through the books of 3 leading authors and the panel that we just heard, where we brought together the practitioners and leading scholars looking at and dealing with this perennial challenge. The North Korean regime's persistent development of nuclear-armed intercontinental missiles is changing the international security landscape with second, third order effects. And we'll get into some of those in tomorrow's panels. During the 3rd and final panel of our summit, we'll continue exploring the traditional security issues. Panel 1 will focus on advancing the U.S. ROK alliance in the 2020s. Victoria Kim, the sole correspondent for the Los Angeles Times, will be moderating this panel. And it'll feature Dr. Victor Cha, Abraham Denmark, Ambassador Kathleen Stevens, Professor Hyunju Yu, and former Foreign Minister Yoon Young-kwan. Our keynote speaker will be Sidney Seiler, who is the National Intelligence Officer for North Korea at the National Intelligence Council in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. Panel 2 will examine what's new and what's old in deterring a nuclear North Korea. The New York Times' David Sanger will be moderating an outstanding panel featuring Professor Graham Allison, General Vincent Brooks, Dr. Oriana Skyla Mastro, Dr. Sumi Terry, and William Toby. Thanks very much for joining today, and we look forward to seeing you for day 3 of the summit tomorrow.